Time and adversity are like a huge blade. They cut through the old and new civilizations. And now in this wasteland, human civilization survives. Huge fortress walls have been erected, but order continues to erode. There was a lot of human technology before the disaster. So why is it all gone now? Why is the whole legacy of the past civilization gone? Of course, there is no way that absolutely everything could disappear. These technologies, like firearms that are far more powerful than they appear at first glance, are in the hands of the few inside these high walls. When disaster strikes, survival is a prerequisite. This new world is filled with danger and cruelty. Everyone who lives outside the wall inevitably comes face to face with the breath of death. But also of those who live inside, not everyone knows peace and satiety. Now, as in ancient times, people must risk their lives to gain sustenance and earn from fate the right to live. What for them outside the walls is their first weapon in the face of danger? What can they counter the inevitable painful demise from the clutches of the creatures that have filled this world and from the deadly hunger that has swept over the human race like a wave? Do you wish to unlock your shackles? The forest outside the wall. The time is nearing evening. The simplest game trap with bait inside is placed on the ground. Bad luck. Before the prey arrived, it rained acid rain. If this guy doesn't bring any prey today, he and Liu Yuan will starve to death. Even an ordinary sparrow will do. At that moment, high in the air, the hunter heard the wing flapping of a large bird. Oh, great! The sparrow has really flown in. Compared to before the disaster, the sparrows have been greatly transformed by various mutations. Now they look more like crows. However, because there are no longer any survivors of the catastrophe, the name of the bird remains the same. Suddenly, a bird flying in the sky noticed a human silhouette below it, standing motionless in place. At the same second, the sparrow changed its direction of flight and rushed towards the silhouette at a great speed. Noticing that the bird had detected him and was heading for him, the guy snapped out of his seat. The sparrow swept its sharp claws past the young man as he managed to bounce and dodge the attack. Running up to the trap he had recently constructed, he immediately grabbed the cast iron ladle designed for catching game in his hand. Taking the weapon in his left hand, the guy turned to face the bird of prey and rolled on his feet on the slippery ground for a couple of meters by inertia. The sparrow immediately flapped its wings and pounced on the young man like an arrow. The predator was much faster than the hunter had expected, and so he didn't have time to react in order to dodge perfectly. Despite the fact that the bird had caught his right arm with its claws, inflicting a rather deep wound, the guy still managed to hit the raptor with a cast iron ladle with a swing. From the power of the attack he delivered, the sparrow flew back a few meters, falling to the ground. While the bird tried to roll over from its back, the young man, putting his weapon behind his back, immediately pounced on the enemy. The very next second, he grabbed the predator by the neck with his hand, pinning it to the ground with all his might. With a clenched fist, the guy broke the sparrow's cervical vertebrae, killing it instantly. With a relieved exhale and rubbing his cheek with his hand, the young man is glad that after waiting all night, he has finally gotten something. It's not too late. And so, slinging his prey over his shoulder, the hunter decides to just head to Lao Wang's store to sell the bird. Judging by the catch, he will be able to exchange it for about a couple days' rations. But no sooner had he taken a couple of steps than the young man's head began to splinter. Falling to his knees and writhing in pain, the guy, trembling, doesn't understand why this is happening now. Usually it happened at midnight, but this time it's much earlier. This has been happening regularly since the day he escaped from the wolves. People in town said it was just a headache, but he knows everything. It's not a simple pain. It's a feeling of pure chaos. As he starts to fall into oblivion, the guy realizes something is wrong. Wait, what's going on? Surprised to open his eyes and look at his hand, the young man can't understand why he's still conscious this time. As he falls to the cold ground facing the sky, he notices the sun's rays breaking through the purple clouds. Covering his face with his hand from the bright light, the lad rises to his feet and sees something majestic before him. Ahead of him loomed a huge dark palace. As he got closer, the young man noticed something strange. Despite the dazzling brightness of this place, this particular palace was enveloped by an unknown dark matter. In front of the guy are huge wooden doors leading into the unknown. Who knows what lies behind them? Without a shadow of a doubt, the young man pushes them with his hands. Inside, he sees a most magnificent structure. All the walls and columns are made of dark marble decorated with gold engraving. Placing his right hand on the hilt of his dagger, the boy cautiously began to look around this strange but beautiful place. There are dark wood cabinets all around, and in the center of this room stands a small round table with a typewriter on it. It is from this table that the most ominous aura emanates. What is this machine, and why is it here? How and why did the guy get into this mysterious dimension in the first place? While he was trying to find answers to these questions, his head began to ache unbearably again. Suddenly, high in the sky, amidst the pouring acid rain, a loud thunder rang out, and a red thunderstorm flashed in the distance. The stranger sitting behind the tree at this time smiles eerily. This man saw among the trees a guy lying unconscious with a huge sparrow in his hands. Waking up, lying on the ground, the boy slowly opened his eyes. He was surprised that he had regained consciousness so quickly this time. Realizing where he was, the agitated young man raised himself sharply. "This is really bad." The rain was getting heavier, so he had to get out of here quickly. As the young man, shaking himself off, rises from the ground, an armed man approaches him quietly from behind, stepping out from behind the trees. Swinging his bone dagger, the man yelled loudly, demanding that he hand over his prey. The next second, the man tasted the cast iron ladle the guy had used to smash him in the cheek, knocking out a tooth. As the guy runs away from the scene, covering his head from the rain with a bucket, the man holding his cheek doesn't understand how this happened. Why was he the victim? What has this dude been through? He's so strong and his movements are so fast. Suddenly, a window with a task popped up in front of the fleeing young man. An unknown force demanded that the loot be handed over to a stranger. As he tries to figure out what the hell is going on, he stares at the strange apparition in bewilderment. Nothing like this had ever appeared in front of his face before. The poor man, who recently received a severe blow to the face, is holding his cheek as he tries to hold back his tears. The moment the thunderstorm flashed, he turned around and saw a monster with a cast iron ladle standing right in front of him, bloodthirstily staring at him. While the victim is screaming hysterically, the friendly guy, holding out the dead bird to him, wonders if the man needs that sparrow. Sobbing with fear and looking at him questioningly, the frightened man shouts that he really wants that bird. "Here you go." Shoving the sparrow into his hands, the boy muttered grudgingly. The delighted man, no longer holding back tears of joy, stares enchanted at the bird in his hands. A window popped up in front of the young man standing next to him. An unknown force informed him that the task had been completed. At that second, in another dimension where the dark palace is located, a piece of white paper flies towards the table standing in the center. As it flew up to him, the paper itself fit into the lectern of the typewriter, securely locked there. The machine immediately printed a test on the sheet. It said that for completing the task, the guy was rewarded with a basic skill copying scroll that allowed him to learn other people's abilities. After reading the same thing in the window hanging in front of him, he wonders what the skill could mean. Could the guy really use it to learn other people's skills? Such as hunting? Or maybe survival? The man sitting next to him interrupts his musings. Taking the boy by his cloak, he tearfully thanks him and marvels at what a good man he is. Turning his attention back to him, the guy took a strange look at what he was holding in his hands. "No way! You'll never get it even if you want it!" he shouted, snatching the sparrow from the hands of the petrified man. In the next shot, the guy is already running off into the trading city with the loot on his shoulder, leaving the dazed man behind to fend for himself. Holy shit! What kind of person are you? This world is definitely going down the drain. A couple of hours later, a guy leisurely approaches the settlement, carrying a huge sparrow on his shoulder. There is a majestic wall with a small market town in front of it. The people living in the small settlement in front of the city wall live poor like most other people in the world. After entering this town, the young man still continues to walk slowly, unhurriedly, to the merchant's shop. A crowd of stout men watch enviously as the guy arrives with a good catch. The gray-haired man, whispering in his bald comrade's ear, remarks that this kid has come in with the loot again. As he passed them, the young man put his hand on the hilt of his dagger, preparing to stab his assailant if necessary. As they get closer to each other, incredible tension begins to build. People are willing to kill each other for food in this world. That's why strength is almost the only way to survive. Noticing the man looking at his prey, the boy glared at him with disdain in his eyes. Just as the gray-haired man decided to start a fight with the brat, he was grabbed from behind by a bald comrade by the shoulder. He asks the man to forget about it and not to contact him. The guy passes on without conflict while the two men stare at him embitteredly. No one dares to go near that young man. He's sick in the head. Once past this tense situation, the hunter walks deep into the settlement. Turning in one of the alleys, he enters a merchant's shop. Throwing the sparrow on the counter with a clatter, the lad asks the merchant how much he would give for the carcass. The frightened merchant asks the young man to be careful. The man asks from now on not to throw his prey so carelessly on such expensive glass. The guy gave the merchant an irritated glance and tisked unhappily. While the merchant weighed the bird, the young man wandered around the shop with not much interest and looked at the assortment. Putting the weights on the scale, the merchant finally learned the final weight of the sparrow. After drawing Xiao Su's attention, the merchant told the hunter that the weight of the prey was 3 kilograms and 600 grams. Taking the bills in his hands, the man, under Xiao Su's surprised gaze, begins to run his fingers over them at lightning speed. Finished, the vendor says that market prices are good now. Sparrows are 200 a kilo, so that makes a total of 700. The irritated young man immediately says it's too little too late. Adjusting his glasses, the merchant looks at the boy unhappily. With one deft move, moving the knuckle count, the man says the maximum he can give for this bird is only 800. There really isn't enough meat in the barrage, but everything has a price, and they have to live by the rules. Suddenly slipping his fingers between the knuckles of the bill and pressing them against the rack, the irritated hunter explains that it's almost winter, and sparrows are scarce these days. Below 900 is out of the question. The stubborn merchant folded his arms and shook his head, unwilling to agree to such unfavorable terms. A second later, Xiao Su is already on the doorstep of the shop, preparing to go outside. The dumbfounded merchant asks the guy where he's going. In response, the hunter explained that he was going to go to Old Li and ask him for his price. Blocking his way, the man asks the guy to wait a bit. Maybe they can come to an agreement. The merchant kindly asks how much he wants to sell the bird for. Xiao Su looks at him blankly and says he'll find out the price first, and then they'll get back to it. Didn't you just say 900? 900 is 900. You don't want to delay Liu Yuan's tuition fees. With a friendly smile, the merchant agreed. He didn't say this to the young man, but the whole thing is that someone from behind the wall came to him today to buy a game. He can't let Old Li take advantage of that. Frozen in place and holding the sparrow in his hand, Xiao Su asked the man what he said at the end. You don't want to delay, right? Having said that, the broadly smiling merchant fell silent. Looking at him emotionlessly, the guy asked his interlocutor to continue. Sweating with nerves, the merchant once again asked the young man what his price was. 1,200, Xiao Su said slyly, squeezing the dead sparrow in his hand contentedly. He demanded the man answer only yes or no. If not, he would go to Old Li. A couple minutes later, the merchant was already counting out bills to pay the well-deserved fee for the goods. After counting to 1,198, the merchant noticed that he had run out of bills. Crumpling them in his hands irritably, the man gives the money to Qiaos, explaining that it's all he has. After turning around and counting the money, the satisfied guy tells the man not to worry. As the sobbing merchant breathes his last breath, Xiaosu explains that he can return the money tomorrow. Holding the bills in his hands, the young man notices something interesting in the assortment. Pointing his finger at the annoyed merchant's head, the guy asks to get the jacket hanging on top. It's just right for Liu Yuan. The merchant, folding the jacket neatly, asks Xiaosu if he would like to buy one for himself. He knows the price. It would only cost 490 for him. The worried man explains that he doesn't carry jackets that often, so if the guy doesn't buy one now, he might get sick in the winter. Saying that he wasn't cold, the young man asked how much the anti-inflammatory drugs cost. The seller explained that one capsule costs 210. This medicine is taken for 3 consecutive days. He could give 3 capsules to Qiaosu for 620. He would also give him 1 dose of iodine as a gift. Looking at his wound left by the sparrow, the boy asked the merchant to forget about it. There are usually no inflammations in winter. After giving the jacket to Xiaos, the man asks the next time he catches a sparrow not to kill it. There are noble people outside the wall who want to keep it for fun. The boy agrees, but warns that it will be more expensive. Early evening, the hut where Xiaosu lives. Pulling back the curtain, the guy steps inside. Upon entering the hut, the young man greets his younger brother, writing something in a notebook. The boy is very happy that his brother is finally back from hunting. Taking a seat next to him, Xiaosu asks his little brother how his homework is going. Yuan replies that everything is fine. However, he feels that listening to the school teacher is not as useful as following his brother on a hunt. The boy asks the brooding fellow when he can watch him on the hunt. Without looking him in the eye, Xiaosu explains that he could be killed at any moment while hunting. Wouldn't it be better for him to go to school and study physics and chemistry than to hunt? Knowledge is the most important thing. The thing is, in this trading town, no matter how messy things are, No one will harass the teaching staff. Resting his hand on the ground and slowly standing up, the guy thinks it's a shame that teaching costs so much. Otherwise, he would have been happy to go and listen to it himself. Heading towards the campfire, Xiaosu tells the boy that he saved some of the giblets before selling the sparrow, and so they can be used to make soup. As the young man took the giblet roll in his hand, his excited younger brother noticed a deep gash on his arm. Putting the meat in the heated ladle, the guy explained that it was just a scratch. After a while, dinner was ready. Xiaosu carefully poured the soup into the plate with his chopsticks. Holding out the giblet soup to the boy asked him to have a good meal. Pushing the plate away with his hands, Yuan says he won't. After all, it's brother who has to eat, he needs to recover. When Xiaosu replied that he wasn't hungry and asked him to just eat some soup, his brother tearfully said again that he wouldn't. And it wasn't some scratch at all after all. The boy had heard that 2 days ago, someone had died of an infection. Not understanding what the tears are for, the older brother angrily threw the bowl of soup on the table. He asks Yuan to understand that they cannot shed tears in this world. This world hasn't believed in tears for a long time. Xiaosu asks his brother to look at these people around them. What if someone comes at night and stabs them to death because Yuan doesn't eat enough? The guy sent him to school because the boy has an aptitude for it, and if he does well in school, he won't have to go into the wasteland early in the morning to earn a living as a young man. After these words, the younger brother sat down resentfully at the table with his head down over his bowl of soup. Trying to hold back tears, Yuan began to eat the giblets with his chopsticks. Patting his frustrated brother on the head, Xiaosu observes that usually when they go out together, the boy is pretty darn smart and cunning. But as soon as they get home, he acts like a crybaby. The boy asks Yuan to have a good meal, and then try on the jacket he bought him. Looking at him, the boy asked where his brother's jacket was then. Dodging the question, Xiaosu smiled happily, explaining that he wanted to rest. As he lay down on the bed, the situation he had been in today in the forest immediately came to his mind. What was this palace he had seen today? After thinking for a bit, the boy fell into a sound sleep. Abruptly opening his eyes, he realized something was wrong. As he stood up and looked around, he realized he was back in this strange dimension. Rising to his feet, Xiaosu noticed that the dark palace had reappeared. Without a moment's hesitation, the young man immediately headed for the huge doors, which this time were completely open. Stepping inside, the boy looked around. Indeed, everything was the same as it had been before. As he approached one of the walls, he stretched out his hand and tried to touch it. As expected, this palace is almost completely intangible if you exclude some elements. Is it really all in his head? Turning around, Xiaosu slowly headed towards the center of the room. As he approached the typewriter, the young man noticed a piece of paper that wasn't here last time. Taking the sheet, he flipped it over and realized it was the basic skill copying scroll he was supposed to receive for completing today's task. Then, glancing at the typewriter on the table, something interesting caught the guy's eye. The keyboard was engraved with many hieroglyphics such as justice, integrity, honesty, trust, friendship, and goodwill. Does this place insinuate that Xiaos needs to be a good person in a world where morality is an unacceptable luxury? No. Rolling the sheet in his hand into a scroll, he realized that this was definitely not going to work out. Deep in the night, a girl dressed in white walks alone down the street of the settlement. Carefully pulling back the curtain, she quietly enters the cabin. Once inside, she sees a long extinct fire and a carefree Xiaosu sleeping on the bed. Feeling the sharp knife at her throat, the girl froze in place. When she saw the armed child, she looked at him, trembling, horrified. "Sister Xiao Yu?" With a surprised look at the girl, Yuan uttered. When the boy removed the knife from her throat, Yui wondered why he was still awake. The child, answering nothing, looked at her with disdain. Leaning toward him, the girl asked where Xiaosu was. She had heard rumors that the boy was injured. Slipping the dagger into its scabbard, Yuan walks over to the table, saying that a sparrow has wounded his brother in the arm. Clasping her hands to her chest, the girl glanced worriedly at the young man lying on the bed. Xiaosu sleeps quietly, lying facing the wall, and does not react in any way to the fact that an intruder has entered the hut. Reminding Sister Yu that she was 8 years older than his brother, the boy sitting at the table explained that that was why she didn't need to get so attached to this guy. The girl is very offended by his words. After all, she thinks of them as brothers. Unable to find the words to answer her, the child simply turned away grudgingly. Still standing on the doorstep, the girl says it's time for her to go home and asks Yuan to tell her brother that she stopped by when he wakes up. Yui then turned around and walked out of the hut. When the boy lost sight of her, he rose from the table and headed for the exit as well. Sitting down on the threshold of the house, Yuan took out a dagger from its sheath and began to observe everything going on around him. Don't constantly bully Sister Xiao Yu. She's having a hard time as it is. A voice came from the hut. Glancing at his brother who had risen from the bed, Yuan explained that this girl was not clean. He saw her smoking the other day. Cigarettes are only given out in factories outside the walls. Maybe she got it from some savage. It seems to him that she got close to Chaosu because the latter could always hit prey when hunting. Who's clean? The boy said, chagrined. After getting out of bed, the young man explains to his brother that if one wants to survive in this world, he cannot stay pure. It's all imposed by life. He asks the boy to just keep his distance with her, not bully her. When his older brother approached him, Yuan agreed. While Xiaosu takes a seat next to him, the boy asks his brother why he is awake. Can't he really sleep? Looking up at the starry sky, the young man explains that he has a lot to think about. He tells Yuan that maybe he has some abilities too. He's not quite sure about that yet. He'll have to try it later to be sure. After these words, he fell silent and looked thoughtfully at the night sky. In the city, they say that some people have special abilities, but he didn't believe it before. Only after meeting Liu Yuan did the guy believe it a little. The day they went hunting together, the boy wished with all his might to strike his prey. As it is, its ability is luck. However, having made a wish, the opposite effect will follow, and there will always be some minor illness or calamity. The younger brother sitting next to him points to the sky and shows Xiaosu the shooting stars. An odd number of stars fell that night. Taking the boy's hands in his own, the boy asked him not to make any wishes. It might come true again. Continuing to look at the firmament, Yuan asks his older brother why the shooting stars are flying so fast. What if someone is too late to make a wish? Putting his hands behind the back of his head, Xiaosu said that there's nothing to think about. They fly fast because they don't want to hear any wishes. The next day, rural school. The teacher standing at the blackboard says that the next topic of the lesson will be about technology in the age of civilization. Holding a book in his hand, he asks the students if they know what the term technology means. While his classmates are chatting, Yuan, yawning, replies that he doesn't know that. The annoyed teacher asks them to be quiet and listen carefully. Xiaosu watches the lesson with interest from the window. Leafing through the book, the teacher is going to explain to the children by example what technology is. As the lesson came to an end, everyone in the class fell silent when they saw someone's head sticking out of the window. The teacher closed the book with a slam. A man announces lunch break, advising the students to go home and eat. Immediately after these words, he abruptly shifted his gaze to the window. But Xiaosu was already gone. Standing against the wall of the school, the boy noticed a teacher approaching him. Standing in front of him, the man said that from this day forward, Xiaosu could stand and listen to the lesson by the door. However, he was not allowed to enter the classroom. Admiring such generosity, the young man bowed to him. Raising his head, the boy smiled happily and thanked the instructor. Food cooked in a cast-iron cauldron is ready. Having poured soup from this cauldron into his bowl, the teacher blows gently on it so as not to burn himself. At this moment, Xiaosu holds out a cigarette to the man, thanking him once again for letting him stand at the door and listen to the lesson. When the surprised instructor accepted the gift, the boy added that the man had allowed him to listen to the lesson at the door, and so he had to show his appreciation since he hadn't paid the tuition. Taking out a small box, the teacher lit a match. Inhaling the cigarette smoke, the man leaned against the wall of his school in satisfaction. Smoking a cigarette, the teacher remarks that, in their troubled times, there aren't many students who listen as attentively as Xiaosu. He asks the boy why he enjoys attending class so much. The young man thoughtfully explains that learning something new is never a bad thing. Also, teachers are the most respected in this troubled world. Pointing his finger at the vegetable garden, the boy says that no one would dare steal, for example, the vegetables in the teacher's yard. And even though they grow right here. That statement made the man cough. Turning to him, Xiaosu says that he has been bothered by one question for a long time. With a glance at him, the instructor asks him not to be shy and to ask. The kid reminds the teacher of what he said in the last class. Before the disaster, there was a lot of technology available to mankind, right? But why did it all disappear? Lack of offspring, the interlocutor replied briefly, exhaling another puff of cigarette smoke. Since the catastrophe period, humanity was lucky enough to survive. They just didn't have time to worry about learning. A surprised Xiaosu remarks that it was always possible to retain some information, wasn't it? It couldn't be that absolutely everything could just pick up and disappear. Nodding sadly, the teacher said that the boy was indeed right, except that this information is in the hands of a few. And these people are behind this high wall separating them from the wastelands and the rest of the dangerous world. An indignant Xiaosu asks the man why then people don't tear down that wall. Most beasts are afraid to attack a group of humans, and as long as they live together, even without this wall, the wolves wouldn't dare to make a move. Not to mention that destroying the wall would allow a lot of technology to be released so that civilization could be rebuilt. The teacher explains to the young man that as long as there is danger in the wasteland, the stragglers will live at the wall of refuge. There will be plenty of cheap labor at the wall, and the consortium behind the wall will keep it from collapsing. How can stakeholders behind the wall abandon this natural class barrier? Putting out the cigarette with his fingers, the man decides to leave the half to smoke next time. When the teacher said it was time for them to go to class, he noticed that the guy immediately blocked his view from view, so the teacher could safely hide his cigarette. After buttoning his jacket, the teacher said that he would go and change his clothes, because his clothes smelled like smoke. It wouldn't be good if the students could smell it. Standing behind him, Xiaosu noticed that the man didn't really care about it when the guy just inhaled that smoke. The teacher didn't even tell him to step aside. At that moment, an unknown force announces the beginning of a new task. The pursuit of knowledge is never easy, but what you learn, you will teach in the future. A few minutes later, upon entering the classroom, the teacher went straight to his workstation. When all the disciples had settled into their seats, they saw Xiaosu standing on the doorstep. Coughing a little, the teacher tells his students that this afternoon will be a survival lesson. He warns the children not to think that danger is far away. Their parents are protecting them now, but when they become adults, they will have to learn to protect themselves. After a few minutes of the lesson, the instructor moves on to another topic and suggests talking about what to do if you encounter a wolf pack in the wild. Pointing his finger at one of the students, he asks him to tell him what he should do when he encounters wolves in the wild. The surprised Xiaosu, still standing on the threshold, gestures to ask if it was him who was just asked. Thoughtfully lowering his head, unless you're really lucky enough to encounter wolves in the wild, the guy advises trying to pick an upland area. When the young man said about the high ground with an open view and a tailwind, the teacher nodded contentedly. A place like this would be a wonderful cemetery for you, and all according to feng shui, shouted Xiaosu joyfully, showing a thumbs up. The teacher skewed in surprise at such a strange and pessimistic answer. After these words, there was a sepulchral silence in the classroom, and everyone present looked at the boy with shame. As he stands there, the young man can't understand why the task was not completed. He didn't seem to have taught him anything wrong. Trying to dilute the atmosphere, the teacher coughed a little. Realizing that the man was waiting for an explanation from him, Xiaosu continued speaking. He explained to the teacher that he had probably never seen a wolf, let alone a pack. Even with one wolf, there was little chance of survival, so it was better to find a good place for a grave right away. Astonished at such a statement of thought and his experience, the man looked in surprise at the guy standing in the aisle. From then on, he allowed the young man to sit in the classroom and listen to the lessons. However, from now on, the survival lessons would be taught by Xiaosu himself. Looking at him admiringly, the boy thanked the teacher for the opportunity. At the same moment, the assignment given out recently ended. As a reward for completing the task, an unknown force gave the guy 1 unit of strength. Looking at his arm, Xiaosu actually felt an increase in muscle strength. It seems that the palace is not just a figment of his imagination. It really does have a special power. The strength value of an adult male was 3 units. Xiaosu used to have 2.5 units. But if he adds the reward to the 1 unit he just received, that works out to more than the average adult. This way, his chances of survival in the wild will be even better. He was distracted from his musings by his younger brother walking home with him. Yuan questions the guy about why Mr. Zhang allowed him to attend school and offered to be a survival teacher. Maybe he wants to make Xiaosu his successor? Upon reflection, the guy replies that it's unlikely. Most likely, this man just doesn't have enough cigarettes. While his brother stares at him incomprehensibly, Xiaosu leans over to him and explains that being a teacher is not a bad thing. When he becomes a real teacher, he will pass the position to Yuan. Turning around and spreading his hands, the lad added that after all, the wilderness was more native to him. He's always like that. If he has something good, he immediately passes it on to Yuan. The boy looks sadly at his older brother. Xiaosu continues to pursue the same line. He explains to Yuan that it is good to be a teacher and that he must study hard and develop himself every day to become a worthy and intelligent person in the future. Noticing his brother lagging behind, the guy turned around and asked what was wrong. Holding out his little brother's hand, he asked him to keep up. Running up to the young man, the boy apologized and said he was on his way. Holding hands, they headed home together. Walking to their hut, the two pass a crowd of armed men who have come out from behind the wall and are heading into the wasteland. One man, nonchalantly pacing beside his companion, resents being asked to go to Mount Jing, even though he wanted to take a few days of vacation. With a glance at them, Xiaosu realized that these people were mercenaries. The man walking next to the disgruntled man says that they should first run into the merchant Wang and try to find someone who can show them the way. So they're going to Jing Mountain? This group of mercenaries from behind the wall don't have enough combat experience. Isn't it just suicide to rush into the wasteland like this? Trying to ignore them, Xiaosu walks further, passing by the armed girl. When she was behind him, the guy turned around dumbfounded. This girl, she gives off the vibe of a wild beast of the wasteland. Looking after them, Yuan asks his older brother if he thinks Merchant Wang would recommend him as a guide. Everyone in the market town knows that the guy is familiar with the wilderness. Xiaosu explains indifferently that one can usually enter the Jing Mountain area on one's own 2 feet and leave with one's feet forward. Whoever wants to go, let them go, but the young man won't go. There is something strange about this group of people, and so it is best to avoid them. Late afternoon, commercial city in front of the wall. Pulling back the curtain, Xiaosu and his younger brother walked back to the hut together. Concerned Yuan asks the guy how his arm is. Is it okay? Turning around, the young man says that everything is fine, but the worried brother asks him not to lie to him. He noticed even yesterday how Xiaosu was trying to hold on through strength. Relaxedly stretching, the boy asks his younger brother not to worry. He's not going to play with his life. Did this Ren Xiaosu really escape from the wolves alive? A puzzled voice from outside suddenly said. Hearing this not far from their home, the brothers turned around abruptly. In that same second, they ducked and began to act quieter, grabbing their daggers. After hiding, Xiaosu looked out through a gap in the wall. The head of the mercenary squad asks Wang Fugui what he meant by saying that this guy is sick in the head. Calming him down, the merchant explains that it's fine and it won't hurt. This young man is not that seriously ill. Here they are already at the place. This peddler Wang had actually brought this group of mercenaries to his house and decided to set Xiaosu up with these people. As he approached the entrance, the merchant asked the guy to step out, saying he had guests. A tense Yuan asks his brother what he should do now. Xiaosu asks him to stay home while the young man himself goes outside to solve the problem. Hanging a cast-iron ladle behind his back and then pulling back the curtain, the enraged guy walks out to the uninvited guests. Congratulations, Mr. Wang, your father and son are safe. 6 kilograms and 600 grams, he shouted, suddenly grabbing the merchant's hands. To be smart is to pretend to be dumb in time. Without realizing what just happened, everyone in the room stares at the weirdo in a daze. One of the mercenaries asks Wang Fugui what kind of father and son this guy is talking about. Maybe he meant capital and interest? After realizing that this was some nonsense, he yelled at the merchant, saying that this schizo was definitely sick. What the hell did he just say? Grabbing the merchant by the scruff of the neck and pointing his finger at the young man, he yells that this dude is definitely sick, and Wang says everything is fine. The mercenary threatens the merchant with death if he continues to lie so brazenly. Blowing off steam, the man walks out of here while Wang tries to stop him, explaining that Ren Xiaosu might be sick, but not that sick. Xiaosu, do you want me dead? Sobbing, the merchant shouted, looking at the indifferently whistling guy. After these words, the merchant ran off with the mercenaries, asking for time to find the right man for the job. The head of the squad gave him until dawn and insistently asked for no such shit. A mysterious girl armed with a sniper rifle had been weaving behind the group the whole time. Turning around, she looked at the crazy guy standing behind her eerily but with interest. Noticing Xiaosu looking at her, the girl averted her gaze and walked on. Not realizing what it was, the guy just stares after her. Suddenly, an unknown force alerted Xiaosu that the necessary skills would be learned randomly. This means that his special ability copying skill works randomly, not by his will. As soon as there is an ability that can be copied within its range, the skill is activated. And now is the moment when the young man crossed paths with such a person. Randomly copied skill. Firearms. You want to learn it? Learn it! Shouted Xiaosu, dumbfoundedly looking at the window that popped up in front of him. At the same moment, he found himself in a dark palace. The skill data began to load. The guy began to receive such information as firearms care, checking their performance, wielding, and other useful skills. These are all firearms skills, so he can really copy someone else's skills? Training success. You have mastered advanced firearms proficiency. When Xiaosu heard this, he was stunned. Wait, wasn't what the typewriter printed out to him back then a basic level scroll? Why did he study the advanced skill? There are two types of skill copying scrolls. A basic level scroll allows you to learn any skill up to an advanced level. A master level scroll allows you to learn the advanced and master skills of others once the wearer reaches an advanced level in one of his own skills. He also has a chance to study the target's supernatural abilities. It turns out he can even learn other people's supernatural abilities? Is that even normal? The guy gets to wondering what was the firearms proficiency of the girl he copied the skill from. When the unknown force informed him that her level was perfect, the young man was greatly surprised. This girl is perfectly proficient in firearms. But why is she serving in a private army? There was really something wrong with this group of mercenaries. Brings Xiaosu to his senses with a strange sensation. Tugging on his older brother's cloak, Yuan wonders to the guy why he's been looking at this girl's back all this time. On whose back? Asked a rather familiar voice from a neighbor's shack. The boys turned around and saw Yu's sister. A surprised Xiaosu asked her what she was doing in his neighbor's house. Fixing her hair, the girl explained that she had switched with a family of 3 who had lived here before. In the future, she would move here and live with the boys in the neighborhood. Snuggling up to Xiaosu, Yuan remarks that this girl spent a lot of money on this, and after all, she used to live in a stone brick house. Brother, you're still a virgin, right? He inquired, whispering in the guy's ear. Grabbing his younger brother by the head, Xiaosu reminds him that the boy is old enough now, and so it's time for them to talk about this aspect of his education. A perplexed Yuan doesn't refuse and allows the boy to ask him about it if he doesn't know something. Still holding that little guy by the head, Xiaosu bids the girl a friendly goodbye and walks into the hut. The boy tells his younger brother not to talk about it anymore. They are barely afloat right now, so there's no need to try to connect them to Sister Yu. But at that moment, the young man notices something unusual. Yuan, pointing his finger under the chair, notices that there are 2 potatoes and what looks like pills hidden there. It's probably to treat an arm injury. Taking the jar of medicine in his hand, Xiaosu confirms that it is indeed an anti-inflammatory drug. He reminds his little brother how last year he had a run-in with the wolves and was injured. That time, too, someone had secretly planted some pills on them to keep him alive. The place where the pills were planted is exactly as it is now. He was trying to find this man. Yuan remarks that it couldn't have been Sister Yu who did this. After all, she didn't know about his injury last year. At that moment, a woman's scream was heard outside. Grabbing the girl's hand, the stranger, congratulating her on her housewarming, holds out a cigarette to her. A startled Xiao Yu says she won't do this kind of thing again. After starting to tear her clothes off, the man laughingly shouts that she will have nothing to eat and drink if she doesn't do such things. And who will give her cigarettes to feed her addiction? Realizing where this situation was going, Xiaosu immediately jumped out of the hut into the street. An unknown force has given him a mission again. The purpose of this new mission is to help. The irritated guy mused aloud that even without this assignment, he would have helped. In the same second, the young man snapped out of his seat and pounced on the pervert, pulling out a dagger from behind his back. The surprised man looked fearfully at his opponent attacking him. With a sly smirk, the bastard can't believe the little kid with the bone knife wants to stab him. In one motion, the man pulled a sharp sword from its sheath and held it out in front of him, showing that it was made of iron. But while he was flaunting his iron sword, Xiaosu had already run up to him and chopped his weapon in half with a sharp movement, also breaking his dagger. "How is this possible?" shouted the dumbfounded pervert, looking at the stump of his metal sword. At that moment, the guy threw his broken bone knife out of his hand. Abruptly grabbing the man's hand in which he was holding the broken sword, Xiaosu delivered a lightning-fast punch with his second fist into his ribs. While his opponent is trying to recover from last night's attack, the cold-blooded guy runs behind his back without letting go of his hand. Not a moment later, the young man had his arm around his enemy and grabbed the man's head, sealing him face down into the ground with all his might. Somehow remaining conscious after such a blow, the pervert can't understand how this brat can be so strong at his age. Pinning the bastard to the ground, the young man asks Sister Yu who it is. The frightened girl said that the man was a foreman at a coal mine. A man was stabbed alive in a shopping town last night, and this man has claimed responsibility for it. Turns out that poor guy had a habit of saving money, and so it turned out that he owed the casino, and so this pervert decided to finish him off. The angered Xiao Su picked up a severed pointed piece of metal from the ground. Preparing to slit this man's throat, the infuriated guy fixed him comfortably. At that moment, an unknown force again gives the young man a new task. The goal is to leave the enemy alive. With a sharp movement, Xiaosu ripped open the flesh of the man, writhing in agony, inflicting a deep wound in the kidney area. Getting to his feet, the guy explained to the man that he had about 3 minutes to spare. If he goes to a clinic in a market town and gets stitches, he might be able to survive. Trying to stop the blood with his hand, the man struggles to get to his feet. As soon as he stood up, he immediately rushed towards the clinic. Since both tasks had been completed, 2 basic skill copying scrolls were given as a reward. Also, since Xiaosu now lacked weapons, he automatically started the side quest. The first building should be the rescue of Sister Yu. But the young man can't believe that leaving the enemy alive was also a full-fledged mission. How did the damn palace make the decision? An agitated Yuan asks his older brother why he just let him go. What if he recovers and takes revenge on the guy? He's not a good person. Xiaosu, in turn, grinning, wonders to the boy if he still thinks the clinic in their trading city will heal his wounds. With a relieved exhale, Yuan was glad to see his brother so ruthless. Looking at the ground, Xiaosu noticed the wreckage of his knife. Raising the hilt, the guy glanced at the girl standing nearby. The frightened Sister Yu with the torn dress is still trying to forget the recent attack. "Can you quit smoking?" Looking at her, the young man inquired. Grateful for the rescue, the girl began nodding her head vigorously. Xiaosu explains that these cigarettes are not highly addictive, but as he knows, they put addictive poppy seeds in them. Stabbing a broken dagger into the ground, he tells her that the merchant Wang had told him that the proportion of poppies there was very small. That is why a girl can quit smoking if she wants to. But I want to make something clear. Even though I'm very handsome, it's impossible between us, Xiaosu dazzlingly says, while holding his head and praising himself. Not realizing what it was just now, Sister Yu froze in place. Looking at the guy still standing in that ridiculous pose, the girl calmly mouthed that she was treating him like a brother. "Ha ha ha ha, that's it, how embarrassing!" The young man laughed awkwardly, rubbing the back of his head. Grabbing his little brother and running back to the cabin, he accused him that it was because of his foolish talk. Looking after them, Sister Yu smiled and laughed. That night, Xiaosu once again found himself in a strange, dark palace. The keys on the typewriter keyboard began typing some text at breakneck speed. A side mission has been opened, and that's kind of interesting. Walking over to the typewriter, Xiaosu immediately snatched a piece of paper from it. The assignment stated that the side quest was given because the guy was now short on weapons. Taking a look at the scroll, the young man remarks that getting a weapon would be really nice. However, something about this assignment is disconcerting. To unlock a new weapon, you need to receive 100 sincere thanks. Thanks can also be used to exchange them for items. While he was reading this scroll, the typewriter started typing some text again. An acknowledgement was received from Li Xiaoyu. There are still 99 more to unlock the weapon. A commendation from Li Yu? The palace is quite accurate in its judgment. Xiaosu is glad that he saved a person who wasn't emotionless. Too bad you can't collect negativity instead of gratitude. In a few minutes, the whole town would have been filled with negativity towards the guy. It is deep in the night. Yuan sits at the table, guarding his brother's sound sleep. "Liu Yuan, say thank you to me!" Xiaosu suddenly shouted, jumping off the bed. The boy sitting in class is dumbfounded and asks what happened to his brother. So suddenly he was a little frightened. Giving him a nudge, Xiaosu told him not to worry and to hurry up and say it. "Thank you for always taking care of me," Yuan said sincerely, lowering his gaze. At the same moment, the palace reported that the thanks from Yan Liu Yuan had been received. With a sly smile, Xiaosu didn't expect it to be so easy. Leaning across the table, the guy leaned over to his little brother and asked him to say it again. Not understanding what else he wanted from him, Yuan grudgingly thanked him again. But this time, the puzzled Xiaosu didn't get anything. Pointing his finger at his younger brother, he accused the boy of not being sincere when he said it. He asks to be sincere when he says such things. Sincere means from the bottom of his heart. He asks Yuan to do it again. The boy shouts out words of thanks. The disgruntled young man standing next to him explains that his brother put little feeling into it and asks him to say it again. When Yuan bowed and uttered an extended thank you, Xiaosu explained that it was still wrong. He should be feeling emotions. When the younger brother tears up demonstratively, the guy remarks that this was exactly what was needed and asks him to try again. Several hours passed in such vain attempts to obtain a sincere thanks. A weary Yuan wondered to his brother if this was his ability. If so, it is not good for the kid's voice. The doomed Xiao Su sitting next to him realized that after half a night of work, he had only received one sincere thanks. Moving back to the palace, Xiao Su walks frustratedly over to the typewriter table, realizing that he should think of something else. Suddenly, out of nowhere, 2 silver coins fall on this table. Trying to figure out where it came from, the guy bent over them and looked up. Taking the coin in his hand, the young man examined it from all sides. One was engraved with the symbol of a heart. Flipping the coin over, he saw what was written on the back. I am grateful to you for being with me all my life, for giving me the courage to be who I am. Grateful for sharing my destiny with me. For the flowers that bloom and fall, I will cherish them all. Suddenly, something strange appears behind Chiaosu's back. Turning around, he sees a small vending machine, shrouded in dark matter like the rest of this palace. As he gets a little closer, the guy tries to figure out what it's for. He's never seen one of these things before. After taking a closer look at the vending machine, the young man notices a small hole for coins. He decides to try to put one of his coins in there. At that moment, some kind of black jar fell out of the vending machine. Taking the jar in his hand and reading the label, Xiao Su realized that it was some kind of medicine. I'm just wondering if you could tell me what it's for. As he wondered this question, he abruptly began to be transported back to the real world. Once inside the hut, the boy was still sitting next to his little brother. However, this time he had that jar of medicine in his right hand. With a surprised look at him, Yuan asked what kind of magic this was. Why did his brother suddenly have a small bottle in his hand? This medicine bottle only has the word cure written on it. Is it a cure-all? Dipping his fingers into the ointment inside, Xiao Su realizes that he has no choice but to try it out. Clasping his eyes, the boy brought the unknown substance to his wound left from hunting a sparrow. Without delay, the young man begins to dab this medicine on the wound. Smearing it, Xiao Su realizes that what he's doing now is reckless. What if it's poison? After all, the character for medicine also means poison. After all, every medicine can become a poison in a large dosage. But as soon as he touched his skin with this substance, the boy realized that the wound no longer hurt. Anti-inflammatory medicine needs to be taken 3 days in a row, but this cream works in one sitting. One anti-inflammatory drug costs about 200. Then the cost of the ointment, if you round it up, is about 100 million. The young man must think of a way to get as many thanks as possible. The next day, early in the morning, when the two came to school, the stunned teacher asked them what was wrong. My brother wanted to. Yuan, who looked like a dead man from lack of sleep, began to speak. Starting to squeeze his younger brother to make sure he didn't say too much, Xiao Su explained that there was nothing wrong with them, and they just didn't sleep well. The teacher asked the boy if he had thought about what he was going to say today. After all, today was his first day as a teacher. A confident Xiao Su asked the man not to worry. They need to find a way to collect a whole bunch of thank you coins. But how to do it? Walking over to the teacher's desk, the guy asked the kids to stand up. As the students rose from their seats and greeted the teacher, Xiao Su had a brilliant thought. The first thing he started the lesson with was to ask the children if they thought it was difficult for teachers to give lessons. Everyone can sit in the classroom, but the teacher stands all day. Then shouldn't the students thank their teacher? The puzzled children agreed with his statement. Then they all looked at Mr. Zhang sitting on the back desk, awkwardly adjusting his glasses. Then from now on, instead of greetings, you will thank your teacher, Xiao Su said seriously, thinking in his head what a genius he was. Raising his hand, the boy suggested that everyone try it right now. When he announced the beginning of the lesson, the students stood up and bowed and thanked the teacher. The bewildered Xiao Su can't understand why nothing is happening at all. None of these little brats even sincerely thank their teachers. Scratching the back of his head, the boy annoyingly recalls the old wisdom that 9 times out of 10, life doesn't go according to plan. Now that it's turned out this way, he'll have to think of something else. Evening came. Drawing something on the blackboard with chalk, Xiao Su is still leading the lesson, explaining that today they will talk about basic wilderness survival skills. The students look at him annoyed because this dude talks too much and still hasn't finished the lesson. At this time, the teacher tells them that rabbits in the wild don't attack people, but they are about as tall as a man's shin and have great strength. When Xiao Su asks to be more careful in the wasteland, one of the students interrupts him. Raising his hand, the boy reminds the young man that the sun is already setting. If the teacher doesn't finish, It will be dark outside, and it will not be safe to go home. Agreeing that safety was paramount, Xiaosu concluded the lesson. The students thanked the teacher again and immediately ran out of the school in a crowd. At this moment, in the dimension where the palace was located, a few coins fell on the table. The delighted fellow was happy to see his efforts paying off. Because of such a long lesson, the students are grateful to him. He is so touched. Walking home with his older brother, Yuan asks him in the future not to further delay lessons like this. An indignant Xiaosu objects, saying that he's willing to give his life to education. What's wrong with sticking around a little longer? Looking at him irritably, his younger brother says that the boy can't go on like this. He will ruin the youth of this country. Xiaosu smacks his brother on the head with the palm of his hand and tells him that he doesn't understand. He still believes that the coins he received are the sincere gratitude of the disciples. Ignoring his brother's ramblings, Yuan, pointing his finger, asks him to look over there. The group of mercenaries that had recently come to their hut at night was walking in front of them. Apparently, they've managed to find a guide. Isn't that old man Liu? Wang, the merchant standing next to him, interrupted him with a disgruntled cough. You heartless little wolf, I recommended you such a good job. I'm surprised you didn't take it, the man said, adjusting his glasses. Xiaosu asked the merchant how he knew that this job would be really good. The merchant observes that the boy seems to be ill-informed. There are poor and noble people living behind those walls, but the poor can't get out of there. These mercenaries who have free access outside the asylum must be noble people. After thinking about it, Xiaosu realized that this high wall seemed to be blocking not only the people outside, but also the people inside. Those inside the walls have a hard time getting out, but those outside are desperate to get in by any means necessary. Tapping the pensive lad on the back, Merchant Wang adds that he has heard from their staff that they are looking for a good guide from the trading city to take him behind the wall so they can utilize his services. Smiling, he asks the young man when else he had such a great opportunity. Yuan asks his brother why he shouldn't talk to those guys in the group again. Xiaosu is much better than that old man Liu. Turning around unhappily, the young man tells the boy to call it a day and tells him to just go home. Walking further down the street, the boys notice Sister Yu standing nearby. The indignant girl tells the man that those earrings are worth a lot of money, and he can't give her so little money for them. When Xiaosu approached her, he put some bills in her hand, explaining that she did not need to sell anything. He would pay for the 3 anti-inflammatory pills she had brought him. While the girl tries to understand what this means, the young man explains that he was going to buy the medicine anyway, so his sister can take the money. He does not reject her kindness, but in the future, they should not be so polite to each other. If it wasn't for the medicine she gave him then, the guy would probably have died. He asks Yui not to worry. Punching himself in the chest, Xiaosu promised that now, as long as he had meat, he would make sure she had soup. Yuan walked over to his foolish brother and whispered in his ear that he had misspoken. Meat is usually eaten with soup. How come while the guy is eating meat, Sister Yu is eating soup? Besides, they don't have meat at home right now. Agreeing with his point of view, Xiaosu asked to be allowed to say differently. In the future, if I have a full bowl of soup, you'll always have a basin to wash it in, the young man said suddenly, pointing a finger at the girl while his junior watched in embarrassment. Smiling happily, Sister Yu agreed. Then from now on, she would do his dishes and laundry for him. At this point, desperate, the woman fell to her knees asking the doctor to help his family. Kneeling on her knees, she says their family can't survive without a medic. Looking at her with disdain, the doctor can't understand the point of going to the doctor if they can't afford it. At the same moment, walking back into his room, the man slammed the door in front of the doomed woman. Xiaosu asks Liu Yuan to remember this. In front of him is their reality. Noticing that acid rain is approaching, the guy suggests his brother hurry home. As they both ran into the hut, Yuan remarked that it seemed to be very easy for doctors to get thanked. They kept thanking the old doctor when he was still here. It's just a pity Xiaosu doesn't know anything about medicine. When he looked away, he asked what kind of nonsense his brother was talking about. Suddenly it hit him. Wait a minute. He may not know how to heal, but he can learn. If he becomes a doctor, he can make money and accept thanks. That's like 2 birds with 1 stone. Early the next morning, a market town. Sitting against the wall, Xiaosu doesn't know what time the clinic usually opens, but it wouldn't be unreasonable to come early. It's been a long time. It's 2 o'clock in the afternoon. Isn't it about time he opened up? Suddenly, the front door of the clinic opened. Stepping outside, the doctor stretched and yawned. Glancing to his right, he was stunned at what he saw. Bouncing away in fear, the doctor asks Xiaosu what he's doing squatting here. The guy looks at him blankly and asks the man to mind his own business and ignore him. The doctor turns around and looks at the young man and tells him that if he wants to see a doctor, he must bring money. Without it, he can sit here all day. At this moment, the palace notified the guy that the target skill would be learned randomly. When the scroll was used, the palace informed him that the deception skill had been randomly selected and asked if the young man wanted to learn it. What the hell? He's here to learn medicine. What's the point of learning deception? This random skill is too random. This dude is so disgusting that he has a skill for deception. The doctor, holding some document in his hand, noticed Xiaosu standing in the doorway looking at him strangely. Looking at him with horror, the doctor remembered the young man. He seemed familiar to him. Isn't he a well-known violent fellow in town? What did he want with him? The man didn't mess with him. Squatting down again, Xiaosu asked the palace what level of medicine this doctor had. His strength answered him that based on the target's information, the target didn't have any medical skills. The enraged guy can't understand how this quack can be a doctor with no medical skills. "So you've been making money from cheating all these years!" shouted Xiaosu, throwing his cast-iron ladle, which he had brought with him especially for such occasions, at the man. Bursting into tears, the doctor asks the guy not to talk nonsense. He wasn't fooling anyone! Taking his ladle, the angry young man walks out of the clinic. Looks like he'll have to think again about how he can become a doctor without learning medical skills. Looking at his arm, Xiaosu notices that the wound he recently received in the hunt is already almost completely healed. That's right! He can heal cuts with that cream! Walking into his house, Xiaosu notices Sister Yu and asks what she's doing here. The girl explained that she saw that the clothes the guy was wearing were torn, and so she came to mend him. Walking over to his younger brother, holding a bowl, the young man asked what it was in his hands. Yuan told him that Xiao Yu's sister had prepared porridge for them. Grabbing his brother in a chokehold, Xiaosu asked the one why he still hadn't said thank you to his sister. When the boy bowed and thanked her, the girl asked Xiaosu to stop beating his brother all the time. In response, the boy explained that Yuan could be spoiled with him, but could not be spoiled with other people. Taking a second bowl and sitting down at the wok, Sister Yu poured more porridge and said that the boys needed to eat more as they were still growing. Xiaosu looked at her in surprise. They had never been told that they were growing. Holding out a bowl of porridge to the boy, the girl asked why he was frozen. She asked him to take the food and sit down at the table. A couple minutes later, both brothers are sitting at the table eating lunch. Looking at the clothes that Sister Yu has recently sewn, Xiaosu notices that she is very good at sewing. He suggests that she come and help them when they open a cut treatment clinic. The surprised girl asks what clinic he's talking about. The young man replies that she will find out when the time comes. Night came. Xiaosu lay down in bed, preparing to move to another dimension. Closing his eyes, he feels a headache. After opening the palace doors, the guy decides to see what he's gotten over the past few days. Yesterday, he traded his thank you coins for a bottle of black medicine, and now he has 3 left. 1 thank you equals 1 jar of black medicine. 1 jar is enough for 3 people. In this case, 1 to 3 is clearly the right solution. The more black jars he buys, the more coins of gratitude he gets. He may be able to unlock his weapons faster. After thinking it over, he decides to get some sleep. In the morning, Sister Yu and Brother Yuan see Xiaosu off, asking him to be careful. He's telling them not to worry. As the saying goes, he who gets into trouble will get all the bumps on his head. And the tall trees, always the very first to be blown around by a strong wind. Xiaos needs to make sure people don't think he's trying to trick them. The man who was pounding out rocks with a pickaxe asked the guy in surprise what he was doing. The protagonist didn't answer immediately, continuing to cut small blades of grass. He then looked back and gave his interlocutor a caustic look. Xiaosu had to give the appearance of an herb picker to avoid being suspected. The boy whispered to his interlocutor that it was not a weed, but a medicinal herb. He explained that if this ingredient was added in different proportions and boiled, the resulting remedy could be used to heal wounds. The hunter then said that it was because of this that he had healed from his previous injuries. The man was surprised and asked if the boy had not endured all this through sheer willpower. A while later, a crowd of gawkers huddled around the protagonist's shack. There was smoke coming from the thatched roof and the holes in it. Xiao Yu was squatting beside a dish warming on the fire. The guy grinned and grinned at the acquaintances standing outside. People on the street looked suspiciously at the hunter and discussed what was happening. It had been a while since Xiao Yu started pretending to boil herbs. He irritably wondered why no one had asked him what he was doing so far. At some point, the guy's patience broke and he ran outside, pointing at one of the men standing off to the side. The troublemaker looked questioningly at Xiaosu and pointed his finger at himself. The protagonist nodded his head and told the man to come over. The man moved awkwardly toward the hunter, listening to the taunts of his friends in passing. Xiao Yu tightly wrapped his arms around the poor guy's neck and ordered him to ask what the guy was doing now. With some consternation, the man complied with the request and asked a question. The protagonist smiled defiantly and pointed to a cauldron nearby that he was making an herbal medicine that not only had anti-inflammatory pain-relieving properties, but also healed wounds quickly. Then he explained that he used to hide his skills from others. However, now the guy realized his mistake and decided to share it with everyone. Xiaosu announced to the public that he wanted to open a clinic to treat cuts and minor injuries. This announcement caused mixed reactions. Many were convinced that the hunter endures his injuries through sheer willpower, and he was incapable of treating anyone. After that, the totally uninterested men turned around and one by one started to leave. The guy realized that this situation was not normal. Looking to the side, he saw the terrified worker still standing nearby. After examining the poor guy's body, the guy noticed that he had a shallow wound on his arm, which was bandaged. Xiaosu grabbed the man's hand and pulled it to the side, asking if the man wanted his excellent medicine. The frightened worker immediately refused. However, the protagonist immediately pinned the screaming man against the wall and took out a vial of medicine. He said that he was now ready to cure the patient for free as an exception. After the drug was applied, the terrified worker ran away in terror. After waving at the poor man, Xiaosu walked back into the shack. Liu Yuan asked his brother why he was giving out free medicine. Gritting his teeth, the protagonist replied that it was the only one. He realized that it was always difficult in the beginning, but those who achieve great accomplishments do not pay attention to such trifles. The next morning, as usual, was completely unremarkable. Xiaosu walked out of his house and met a merchant right at the entrance. Such an unexpected encounter made him tense. The boy asked Old Wang what he was doing here so early. Just in case, the hunter explained that he had not been out sparrow hunting lately. However, the merchant was utterly delighted. He happily asked if it was Xiaosu who had cured Teitu in the eastern part of the trading city yesterday. Without waiting for a reply, Wang Fugui asked the man if he could sell him the medicine. The guy shook his head and said that he worked without intermediaries. The old man said that in that case, he could only buy a couple of jars. However, Xiaosu noticed that his interlocutor was not injured at all. Wang Fugui shared with the boy that yesterday, Teitu felt that something was wrong and wanted to know what the ointment he was given was. The worker decided to taste it. The protagonist was surprised that this black medicine could be taken internally. Immediately, the merchant's eyes shone, and he said that as soon as that man tasted the black ointment, he fisted with his wife all night. The old man again tried to get information about the sources the protagonist used to obtain this ointment. Xiaosu replied that it was his inheritance. Then the guy looked at his interlocutor and asked why he needed this ointment if he was already a bachelor. The merchant replied that the boy didn't have to worry about that. Xiaosu nodded his head and said that the price of familiarization was 600. The old man immediately took out the bills without a second thought and handed them to the guy, at the same time thanking him for the favor. At the same moment, the system counted Wang Fugui's gratitude. The satisfied merchant turned around and headed for his home, while the protagonist stayed behind with mixed feelings. Meanwhile, a small group of people had gathered near the huge gate this time. Wang Fugui, keeping his eyes on the vial he had bought, walked over to the people in clean business clothes. He then held out the medicine to a man in an expensive jacket standing across the street and said he had brought the very thing. Meanwhile, Xiaosu unfolded the signboard he had hand-drawn. He finally managed to open his own cut clinic. But no sooner had the protagonist finished with the registration of his new place of work, as immediately near heard moans. 3 of the wounded men approached his house. They were bleeding and barely able to stand on their feet. Nevertheless, the troublemakers walked past the shack and headed towards the clinic they usually went to. Xiaosu glowed with happiness when he saw his first customers. The system immediately activated the task of rescuing the 3 patients. Realizing that these idiots weren't going to stop here, the protagonist slapped his hand on his face and apologized to them. Then the guy abruptly snapped out of his seat and caught up with the departing men. On the move, he knocked down the stunned poor people who didn't even have time to realize or react in any way. The weakened workers weren't a big problem, and after a while the protagonist dragged them to his hut. One of the wounded men looked at the guy in horror and asked what he wanted. Xiaosu explained that the doctor they usually go to was a quack, and only in this clinic can these people save their lives. After saying that, the guy called Nurse Xiaoyu over, saying that they had their first patients to treat. The girl went outside and looked at the wounded. She wondered if the poor people had been caught in some kind of group fight. One of the men with a deep cut on his shoulder explained that a boiler had exploded in their factory. He added that the three of them were lucky to escape with minor injuries and were able to make it here on their own. A large number of workers simply died on the spot. Xiao Su thought that in the current times, no one would run to save the injured person for free. Rather, the reverse would happen, and people would wait until you died to take everything you owned. The protagonist turned to Xiao Yu and said that she should first disinfect the needles and sew up the wounds. The girl looked uncertainly at the guy, and the guy explained that it was about as uncomplicated as mending clothes. Xiao Yu nodded her head and began heating the needles to red hot. Then she brought her trembling hand to the skin of one of the patients. The people standing nearby watched the process in horror. After touching the tip of the needle, the man wailed in pain. He looked at the girl with crazy eyes and said that he understood what such sterilization methods were for. However, the needle needs to cool down first. Xiaosu defended his partner. I said that she was very new as a nurse. Then he opened a jar of medicine. Hunter looked at his patient and said that his drug was very valuable, but he would charge the same amount of money as a doctor in a clinic would charge. Plastering the client's wound, Xiaosu said with a smile that usually a worker in this position received 2,000 or 3,000 a month, so he should be able to pay 600 for his life. The man agreed and asked to be a little gentler with him. Meanwhile, one of the wounded men began to take slow steps toward the exit. After the protagonist noticed this, the patient started to run away. Xiaosu was surprised that the guy wanted to escape so easily. The second customer also took a few steps towards the exit, but immediately the protagonist grabbed him from behind. Xiaosu told Xiao Yu to sew up the second man's wound while he caught up with the third man. After the worker was placed in the hands of the nurse, the protagonist quickly ran after the third patient. Wounded, the workers couldn't run very far. A few blocks later, he stopped to catch his breath. Nevertheless, it seemed to the man that he had managed to get away from there. But suddenly, a heavy hand fell on his shoulder from behind. The man turned around in horror, unable to believe that he had already been caught up so quickly. Standing behind him, Xiaosu said in an orderly tone that it was time for them to go get treated. A couple minutes later, the protagonist entered his cabin with the last patient on his shoulder. Sometime later, the last employee went through the same procedure as his co-workers. The system announced the completion of the task and increased strength and agility as a reward. At the same time, the wounded were surprised that the medicine had already started working, and the pain was almost gone. Meanwhile, the protagonist was surprised by a new assignment. According to it, it was necessary to cure 10 patients. It seemed to be a whole chain of quests. That same night, the situation in the town became very aggravated. The settlement was attacked by wolves. The news greatly alarmed the residents. Xiao Su realized that not everyone would survive the night. A frightened Liu Yuan asked his brother if the wolves would come to their trading city. The hero shrugged and said that these creatures were smarter than one might think, so they were unlikely to risk coming here. Surely this time the wolves must have been attracted by the smell of blood from the ruined factory. After all, the trading city would probably be protected by people from behind the wall. Suddenly, Liu Yuan asked his brother how he survived the last encounter with the wolves. Xiaosu sighed heavily and thought that sooner or later he would still have to talk about it. But suddenly a beeping sound was heard not far from their house. A man near the gate beat frantically at the bell and shouted that the enemy had been discovered outside. Approaching the roof of the house, Xiaosu wanted to pull back a piece of cloth to see what was going on. But then he stopped and looked excitedly in that direction. Liu Yuan asked his brother why he was so worried. Suddenly, the main character asked what would happen to them if one terrible day the wall collapsed. The frightened Xiaoyu looked at the guy and asked if this could really happen. Xiaosu calmly replied that he could not assume, however, nothing in this world was eternal. Suddenly, the massive iron gate rattled open. A detachment of heavily armed men entered the settlement. They were all well-equipped and had modern weaponry. Liu Yuan asked his brother what kind of weapons these people had. In response, Xiaosu told the boy not to ask too many questions. The child irritably asked if he had any status in this family. The older brother replied that the boy shouldn't think too much and should just get on with his life. The masked soldier reached out and said that because several people had died in the factory, they would now have to kill wolves all night. His fellow soldier asked his partner to stop complaining, because it was an order from above. The protagonist closely examined the rifles the soldiers were armed with. Thanks to the skill he had acquired, he knew everything about these weapons and would be able to use them immediately upon receiving them. The group spread out across the plaza and headed toward the factory. Xiaosu looked thoughtfully at the people leaving. Then he told his younger brother that he would go to his sister's house for a while tonight and return home in the morning. After that, the protagonist headed towards the exit. Liu Yuan excitedly asked his brother where he was going. However, the guy didn't answer and promptly ran towards the departing soldiers. Meanwhile, the teacher was shaking his whole body and getting very tense. He was squatting and trying to go to the toilet. However, something was not working. At the same time, Xiaosu was moving quickly through the streets. Suddenly, the teacher saw a guy rushing over. He wondered greatly what this boy had forgotten outside at this late hour. Running outside the settlement, the protagonist towards the factory. The guy remembered that the factory manager was armed with a pistol, but was still attacked by the wolves. There was a high probability that the director didn't have time to draw his weapon, not knowing that the monsters would come for him. Xiaosu really hoped that the gun was still in the factory. Meanwhile, black acrid smoke enveloped the buildings of the production hall. The protagonist ran into the main building and stopped on the spot in horror. Right in front of him, amidst dozens of corpses, was a part of an armed squad. Directly across from them was a pack of huge gray wolves, watching with hatred for their victims. For the time being, both sides stood without taking any active action. The military realized that these beasts were not afraid of bullets at all. Behind the armed men stood men in civilian clothes who looked nervously at the inaction of their defenders. Suddenly, one man's nerves were frayed. A man in a business suit pushed the soldier, ordering him to shoot. The guy in the bulletproof vest shot out of fear. His bullet hit exactly on target, piercing one of the nearest wolf's paws. However, the monster didn't seem to pay any attention to this at all. The wolf just looked at the man angrily and growled even harder. Suddenly, the entire pack in a unified rush pounced on the stunned humans, who were caught off guard for the first few seconds. Some of the military men only had time to scream before huge, tenacious paws clawed at them. The guy who shot first was the closest to the wolves. The next moment, his head was torn from his body with a loud crunch. Realizing that it was urgent to leave here, the protagonist headed for another building. Running through the empty workshops, Xiaosu assumed that the private army was fighting wolves and all personnel had been recalled, so this side of the factory should be safe. Approaching one of the walls, the protagonist stood still and listened. There was absolute silence all around. Then the boy examined the bodies of the men. Judging from the nature of the wounds, the wolves had killed them with a single blow. Xiaosu was once again glad that he had avoided meeting those monsters. Right in front of the guy was a view of a huge building. He decided he needed to get in there and check out the surroundings. After bouncing off the production boxes a few times, the guy jumped onto the ladder leading to the roof. Climbing up, he kept his balance and looked around again. Xiaosu could feel a little freer now. Still, he had to hurry, for being here was becoming more dangerous by the second. The protagonist threw a hood over the top in case he still encountered living people. He then took out his dagger and prepared it for battle. Jumping up on the spot, Xiaosu fell under the glass and flew down. Once on the ground, the guy squatted down and surveyed the facilities. Now he was finally inside one of the plant's most key buildings. There were also quite a number of corpses around. This time, however, there was a suspicious pattern to the pattern of deaths. It looked like there had been a battle here, but for some reason, all the bodies were pointing in the same direction. That's when Xiaosu realized that in a critical situation, people run to safe places or wherever the weapons are. This hypothesis was confirmed by bodies located all around the perimeter of the staircase. After descending a few floors, the guy came to a place whose presence raised many questions for him. Directly in front of him was an armored metal door. It was an emergency shelter. There were many corpses of workers near the closed entrance. However, the door was locked, which was very suspicious for a situation like this. Intending to figure out what was going on here, Xiaosu knocked on the door a couple times. Suddenly, suspicious sounds started coming from the direction of the shelter. Meanwhile, the man on the opposite side pressed a large button on the wall. At the same moment, the huge sealed door came into motion. The passage had not yet had time to open all the way, but the lad immediately burst into the shelter. In front of him, he found a man with a gun in his hands, his hand on the button. The man expected the army to come for him. However, instead he saw a stranger. Before the hood flew off the protagonist's head, the man with the gun recognized the unexpected guest as Ren Xiaosu. The man pointed his gun at the thief, saying that he had heard of the smart and agile man from the market town. Xiaosu stood in a half-crouched posture and did not move. He recognized the man opposite as the factory manager named Wang Dongyang. Without putting the gun aside, the frightened type pressed the big button again. After that, the sealed door moved again and closed. Seeing this, the protagonist realized that he was about to be trapped. Now he was left one-on-one with a man who had a serious firepower advantage. Xiao Su closely examined the gun in his opponent's hands. His attention was drawn to the fire mode displayed on the weapon. Suddenly, the boy spread his arms out to the sides and greeted Wang Dongyang. However, the armed type was scared and said that the boy couldn't come any closer to him. Then Xiao Su asked why the principal was here alone. After the manager didn't answer, a realization came to the protagonist. He looked angrily at his opponent and realized that he had run in here first, then closed the door without letting the others in. The frightened man with the gun ordered the poor man to stop asking too many questions and instead take him to town. The manager said it was the only way to keep the boy alive. The guy grinned at such a strange suggestion and asked what would happen if he told everyone about how the manager had ditched all his employees to survive on his own. Wang Dongyang grinned, not understanding what the guy's tactics were. Then the manager shook the gun again and shouted, "Does the brat think he won't have time to kill him?" The director assured the guy that he would just wait for the army to come, because support always comes for people from behind a wall like him. Suddenly, Xiao Su got into a fighting stance. He then asked his opponent if he didn't realize that his weapon was on the safety lock. Just then, Wang Dongyang looked at the gun and noticed that he had forgotten to change the firing mode. The protagonist pounced sharply on his opponent that second and took his arm to the side, blocking the path of the weapon. After disarming the manager, Xiao Su delivered a powerful elbow strike to his enemy's stomach and threw him back. The factory manager barely had time to rise to his feet before a blade was immediately thrust into his stomach. At the same instant, Wang Dongyang realized that he had lost this battle. Out of his last strength, hoping to keep him alive, the manager said that if the fellow would let him go, he was willing to show him where his property was hidden. The boy boldly parried this pathetic ploy, saying that Wang Dongyang should first tell everything he knows. Hearing this, the factory director grinned. He felt that this brat was still inexperienced. In order to survive, Wang Dongyang had to stall until the private army reached to his rescue. However, Xiao Su understood his opponent's intentions. He asked if the manager really thought he could last long with his lungs punctured. Without waiting for an answer, the protagonist said that he would ease the choice and decide Wang Dongyang's fate. In the next instant, the guy stabbed the bastard's chest with his blade. He then withdrew his blade from his defeated opponent, and the helpless carcass collapsed to the ground. After making sure his opponent was dead, Xiao Su squatted down and searched his pockets. The guy was happy to find 2 extra pistol clips in the factory manager's pants, which were just in the right place. After that, the hunter left the shelter. After a final look around the workshop, he decided that he had to get out of here as soon as possible before a team arrived to rescue Wang Dongyang. For a while afterward, the panting protagonist piled into the house. Liu Yuan ran out to his brother and was glad that he was unharmed. Xiao Su replied that he was fine and asked if the military had returned. The younger brother, examining the protagonist's arm, said that part of the squad had returned with wounded fighters. The boy also explained that the returning groups took with them the corpses of their dead comrades and wild wolves. As it turned out, the remaining unharmed groups continued their journey through the plant. After drinking the hastily prepared drink, Xiao Su realized that firearms still had a deterrent effect on wolves. This meant that against a private army with guns, the monster's chances of victory were still too low. Suddenly, 2 SUVs pulled out of the gate with armed men sitting on them. Arriving in the center of a neighborhood, the military disembarked and ordered all residents out into the street. The awakened workers were reluctant to come out of their homes, asking what had happened. One of the armed men explained that a large reward would be given to anyone who told who left the trading city today. Zhen Xiaosu and Liu Yuan were among the last to emerge from their huts. The protagonist tensed as he heard the military's demands. The guy realized that it was probably about him. Before leaving the factory, he disguised the wound he inflicted on the manager, as if he had been killed by a wolf. A normal person wouldn't have been able to tell the difference. Most likely, the military found out that Wang Dongyang's gun was missing. It was very unusual for them to make such a fuss over a missing gun. Suddenly, a hand went up in the crowd. A man said he saw someone coming out in the middle of the night. When asked by the military man who the person in question was, the teacher said it was Ren Xiaosu. The man turned around and pointed his finger at the protagonist, saying that he had seen everything with his own eyes. Such an incredible act of betrayal shocked the guy to the core. The commander of the military detachment ordered his subordinates to search the suspect. But as soon as the armed men got close to the boy, a merchant appeared out of nowhere. Wang Fugui reminded him that Mrs. Luo had asked from behind the wall to keep an eye on this boy, and he should not be treated like this. The commander of the armed squad asked what it was all about. But the merchant replied that they should go to Luo's boss for all the information, because he could not divulge this information. The military man thought hard. To cross the road to such a man was a very rash thing to do, but still, they failed the mission. Therefore, the military man said that even if it was one of the boss's men, it was a serious matter, for the culprit must be found. He also explained that he would still have to make it up to Mrs. Luo in the evening. The two armed men immediately took the protagonist under their arms. There was nothing the boy could do about it, and they could only wait meekly. Liu Yuan suddenly ran out of the shack with a knife. He realized that his brother was involved in something, so he looked threateningly at the soldiers and shouted that they couldn't come here. Xiao Su realized that this could all end very badly and ordered his younger brother to step back. The child was trembling all over his body, but still continued to block the path of the armed men. Only the teacher was watching the events unfold with a satisfied smirk. Finally, the boy lowered the knife and the armed men entered the shack. Immediately, they began a detailed search of every corner and object. Liu Yuan crossed his arms and prayed that these people would not find anything here. The irritated team leader asked his subordinates if they had found anything in the house. The military men replied that there was nothing here. One of them explained that the place was practically empty, and if there had been a gun somewhere, they would have found it long ago. Not noticing the weapons lying under the iron vat, the soldiers stood up and approached the commander. The leader of the group said that in that case they were leaving here. Hearing this, Liu Yuan finally allowed himself to exhale. After that, the military gave a last look at the protagonist, who defiantly waved his hands at them. The uniformed man stepped aside and Xiao Su looked angrily at the teacher. The guy then walked over to Wang Fugui. The old man was glad that everything had ended well, but he noticed that it seemed like he shouldn't have interfered. After Xiao Su thanked the merchant, Wang Fugui said that if it wasn't for Boss Luo's admiration, he wouldn't have dared to intercede for the guy. Finally, the boy was able to inquire as to which such lady was now in question and how the man knew him. The merchant leaned almost closely to the protagonist and explained that Boss Luo is the representative of the Qing Consortium behind the 113th wall, and he is in rabid excitement about the protagonist's medicine. Xiao Su only then realized why Wang Fugui needed that medicine. The old man also said that from now on, the guy would take a portion once a month, in which case Boss Luo would guarantee no future problems outside the walls. Suddenly, the protagonist asked the interlocutor if he could talk to this lady and guide them behind the wall. The old man reminded them that dirty people like them could never settle behind the wall, and then there would be no one to gather herbs for Boss Luo. The guy realized that this mistress clearly just wanted to get some use out of him. At the same moment, the old man sighed and said that he wanted to get in it all too. Suddenly, Liu Yuan, who had been standing silent until then, called out to his brother. The boy was shaking all over, as if he was feverish. To avoid falling, the child grabbed onto the cape Xiao Su was wearing. However, even so, he was unable to stay on his feet, and after a few seconds, Liu Yuan fainted. The protagonist looked at his brother in horror and immediately rushed towards him. A while later, the baby was carried into the house and placed on the bed. Xiao Yu, who was sitting next to him, changed his bandage time after time. Xiao Su was furious that his brother had spent too much energy and emotion for the sake of saving him again. The boy talked himself out of it, explaining that he didn't want anything to happen to the main character. At the same moment, Xiao Yu wrung out another towel and placed it on the boy's forehead. The child apologized to his sister for having to fuss with him. The girl pointed out that both guys were acting like little kids, and if they weren't more mature than the others, they wouldn't be alive right now. The protagonist looked thoughtfully at the whole situation going on. He stood up and promised his loved ones that he would be sure to make sure they lived well and denied themselves nothing. After that, petty sneers and chuckles were sprinkled towards the guy. After a while, it's a new day outside. Early in the morning, Xiao Su went out for a walk to collect some water. Suddenly, a familiar voice congratulated him on something, and the guy looked suspiciously straight ahead. Wang Fugui was standing right in front of him. Xiao Su made it clear that he didn't understand what he was talking about. Then the merchant explained that last night, Yu Tong was scared to death and ran away with the money. Therefore, the protagonist is now the only doctor in town. Suddenly, the old man held out a box to his interlocutor. He explained that the manager behind the wall had allocated Yu Tong's house to Xiaosu's needs. After that, the merchant handed the main character a box. He explained that he had prepared a small gift for both boys, and it was something they could eat to keep their bodies in shape. The guy opened the box and found some white object inside it that looked like an egg. Wang Fugui explained that this thing was called Swallow's Nest, and he had kept this object for many years. Xiaosu looked at the item with some suspicion and explained that these sockets were rumored to be bonded by liquid. In addition, saliva is most likely used to bind the items together. The protagonist took the egg and held it out to the old man. He flatly refused to take the object, saying that it was even more disgusting than the bloody bird's nest. The merchant then put his arm around the guy, saying that he had a conversation to have. Wang Fugui explained that the guy hadn't been shopping for herbs for the past few times, so there was a chance that the black medicine would soon run out. The protagonist naively asked if the product had already run out, because it had been bought recently. However, the old man immediately shouted at the boy, saying that he didn't just buy it for someone, but for the big man behind the wall. The boy started to look away, but Wang Fugui immediately said that the brat should have respect. After all, he had gotten an entire clinic for practically nothing. Suddenly silhouetted, turns around and holds out a vial of cream, saying, "Then it will cost 1,200. For the first time in a very long time, the merchant didn't try to drive the price down and took the jar right away. At the same moment, the system added another sincere thanks from Wang Fugui. Then the boy thought that this old man was quite sincere. Lastly, the merchant said that the boy could already pack his things and move into the brick house. Some time passed, and all three travelers reached their new home. They stood near the main door with some trepidation for a few more minutes. The family then decided to go indoors and look around. The curious Liu Yuan pointed his finger at the strange banner hanging right in the center of the room. The protagonist examined the inscriptions and explained that it says about coming back to life with skillful hands. Suddenly, a task appeared in the system. The activity suggested continuing to rescue 10 patients. But before Xiaosu could look around, he was immediately called out from behind. It was a married couple. The main character immediately smiled and asked what their injuries were, reminding them that coming to him was a good idea. The resident chimed in that his wife was only 4 months pregnant, but this morning she had a stomachache. The worker himself was scared that something would happen to her, and he came to the clinic for advice. And that's just how hard Xiaosu's advice is to dispense. The guy thought about it and realized it would be a little more difficult with her pregnancy. Suddenly, he asked who the worker wanted to save, the mother or the child. This question instantly shocked both parents. This phrase did not work very well. The main character apologized and admitted that he knew nothing at all about gynecology, and it would be dishonest of him to continue fooling uncomprehending patients. He then lightly embraced both of the prospective parents and explained that they could borrow some books from Mr. Zhang at school without taking any pills. It was then that Xiaosu thought that his mission was done for now, and raising his hand, he bid farewell to the visitors, who stared at each other shockedly for a few more seconds. As he turned around and headed for the exit, the worker said that he at least felt that the new doctor was much more honest than the previous one. In the past, the clinic manager primarily promoted medicines for purchase that might not be suitable at all. Sensing that there was a big difference between these people after all, the couple turned around and, even though there was no help, thanked the doctor. The system popped up 2 new notifications, and it appeared that Xiaos had been credited with 2 commendations. But both of them came from a woman. In any case, the main character's expectations were beginning to come true. Now he could just give advice or tell people the right way to get thanks for nothing. From that point on, the guy decided that he would only treat what he knew. A few days later, a man came in with a deep wound to his arm. There was a commotion in the clinic. Xiaosu asked Xiaoyu to help him with the patient. Without any anesthetic, the girl started stitching the skin together. The man could hardly contain himself and shouted that it was very painful. After a while, as the hole had more or less healed, the victim was visited by his mother. They thanked the doctor and he wished them well. Lastly, Xiaosu reminded that the elderly should drink plenty of boiled water. At the same moment, the player had already saved 10 people. The system announced the end of the task and the start of a new phase to rescue 20 patients. Guy realized that the difficulty had increased and asked the palace what his current strength and agility scores were. The system notified that the strength index was 5.5 units, the dexterity index was 4 whole and 1/10. Xiaosu decided that this wasn't too bad. Standing nearby, Liu Yuan suddenly asked his brother, why didn't he just try to treat their people? In response, the main character explained that he just didn't know how to do it and there was no one to learn from. Moreover, the previous doctor also did not have any medical knowledge, yet he managed to teach people and even deceive them. The guy explained that I couldn't profess the same principles. After all, now that that guy was in trouble, no one would help him. So you have to have some humanity. Liu Yuan explained that these days, many people would be happy if something happened to them. So he wondered what would become of their clinic if there was no one to help. Suddenly, the older brother turned around and walked quickly over to the boy, clapping him on the shoulder. Xiaosu seriously looked into Liu Yuan's eyes and said that they should not be allowed to replace emotions with an all-encompassing world sorrow. No sooner had the protagonist said this than someone looked out from behind the door. Xiaosu looked at the passage in surprise, for the man didn't even say anything at first. But then, the agitated stranger explained that he had a big problem. However, he wanted what they were about to see to remain confidential. The protagonist thought it was about very savory things. He said that if the visitor had a problem with his little friend, he had come to the wrong place. However, the unidentified man immediately closed the door and said that was not the case at all. He looked at the clinic owner caustically and said he would have to demonstrate it, but no one should be intimidated. This kind of strange wording made Xiaosu very tense. He tensed up and prepared for something strange to happen. Suddenly, the patient began to draw huge amounts of air into his mouth, inflating it to an unbelievable size. A couple seconds later, he made one big spit, and a bright light poured out of the man's mouth. A small purple sphere appeared in front of the protagonist's face. Xiaosu thought that this couldn't possibly be the finale. Indeed, the spherical object hung in the air for a few more seconds and then burst. In the same instant, a powerful stream of wind created a vortex just inside the room. The shockwave from the cleavage was so strong that Xiaosu could barely stay on his feet, while Liu Yuan was thrown to the corner of the room. The child was surprised by such power, thinking they were under attack. However, the protagonist saw great potential in it. He looked at the slightly terrified resident, thinking that the power wasn't very high, but it was definitely not something that could be done with a normal bubble of saliva. Xiaosu explained that in his opinion, the worker was not sick, but instead had some supernatural abilities. A surprised resident asked if it was like just taking a turn into a train out of thin air or something. The protagonist replied that it really is. The man made a very low bow and cheerfully said that he would immediately report to his parents and friends when he got home. This action also added gratitude to the quest. A short while later, the hero's first day in their new environment was over. Lying in his new bed, Xiaosu thought that people with abilities were starting to appear in small trading towns, and there was a chance that these times would change sooner or later. Yet, while the world was becoming much more dangerous, Xiaosu still had a palace. The guy had gathered a lot of gratitude today and hoped to unlock the weapon as soon as possible. Suddenly, a strange rustling sound was heard in the backyard of the house. The very badly asleep protagonist immediately got up and listened. Meanwhile, 3 unidentified men climbed the fence and ended up on the property. All 3 thieves made it safely over the fence and landed in the courtyard. Here, however, they were already waiting for them. When the thieves looked up, they found the owner of the property in question standing right in front of them. Unwilling to listen to further entreaties, Xiaosu kicks his opponent between the legs with a swing. The cowering thief, holding his stomach, immediately slumped to the ground. Trying to move away from the pain, he immediately ordered both of his underlings to attack the naked boy. The bullies instantly heeded the order and pounced on the defiant brat. However, it turned out that the guy is such an outcome of events, not at all surprised. A few seconds later, several powerful thumps were heard in the courtyard. It was then that all 3 thieves knelt down and begged for mercy, just so long as it was not death. Xiaosu was interested in such a peculiar action and asked who had ordered this robbery. Suddenly, at the same instant, a painfully familiar voice began knocking on the door. It was the military again, with a much more reinforced squad. Hearing the palace gates begin to bang, Xiaosu was surprised that both the robbers and the military were awake that night. Opening the door, the protagonist saw the very same officer. The man said that they had a search order. Suddenly, the owner of the establishment came out to the fighters. Most of the armed men were immediately shocked. A strange-looking boy came out to them with a cloth standard thrown over his neck. The boy was very curious, and he asked why the whole group was here so late. In fact, the main tactic for Xiaosu was the surprise effect. Ideally, the military should have been distracted by the flagpole and not continue their search. The captain was one of the few who made no comment on such a performance. Pointing his finger at the entrance, he once again ordered the troops to search the room. After several troopers entered the building, the officer personally pushed the owner aside. He explained to the new doctor that it made no difference when they wanted to search. Xiaosu looked at the military with strong confidence. Suddenly, the leader of the squad catches sight of the bound hostages. He asked what was wrong with these people, to which Xiaosu replied that they had been sent here to look for weapons. This overly calm demeanor of the prime suspect was beginning to infuriate the military man, as the uniform introduced himself as Wang Kunyan. He also added that if a guy wants to express his dissatisfaction, he can do so through his name by contacting Boss Luo. The protagonist also laughed, wondering what kind of threat he could be. In reality, the guy was actually greatly afraid that Wang Kunyan and Wang Dongyang would have some similarities. The boy realized that they were not going to let him go so easily. But suddenly, a few minutes later, the deputy commander announced that the hut was empty and no firearms were found in it. Wang Kunyan looked at the owner of the premises with disbelief and explained that they had never found the one who stole the gun. Until then, they would continuously search the houses. Walking not far from each other, the paramilitary squad leader patted the suspect on the shoulder and said that if he had been born behind the wall, he would have probably become a great soldier, unlike this bunch of trash. The soldiers got into the car and, turning on the headlights, started on their way. The protagonist was glad that he had hidden the gun on the mountain 2 days ago while gathering herbs. When the car started, Xiaosu finally allowed himself to exhale for the first time in a long time. As expected, the murder had really caused him a lot of trouble. Having dealt with the unexpected attacks, outbursts finally went to bed. Early in the morning, the boy heard a strange noise that made him wake up. Dressed in rags, the protagonist and his brother walked towards the motorcade. Liu Yuan noticed that these people had only been away for a week, which was very strange for this kind of operation. Indeed, after returning, all these people no longer looked so powerful. Before they left, they were clean and healthy. Now one was dirtier than the other. It was the views of all these people that changed. Judging from the mentioned charts, they shouldn't have even reached the foot of Mount Jing, which was their goal. For a moment, the protagonist realized that out of this entire squad, one person stood out very strongly. He looked at this girl who wielded the rifle perfectly. There wasn't a scratch or a speck of dust on her, just like before she came out. She really did seem to be much better than the others, and Liu Yuan, who was observing all of this, assumed that this entire group was now heading towards Old Man Wang. Most likely, in the end, his recommended guide didn't make it back. Something must have happened to him on the way. As expected, the troop arrived at the merchant's house. The girl who was ahead of them asked why the guide didn't know the roads. Because of his modest knowledge, they had been traveling for 3 days and even changed directions several times. The old speculator could not believe what he had heard, but at the same time he asked what was the fate of his guide. The girl explained that he had been bitten by something in the river, and when they pulled out the guide's body, he was already dead. However, something didn't add up. Xiaosu remembered that there was no river that matched the description nearby. The merchant explained to the girl that he had immediately said that he had to find Ren Xiaosu to get to Mount Jing. However, he didn't have time to work as a guide right now because he was working for Boss Luo. The woman asked if she was talking about the guy who had a problem with his head. The trader confirmed her speculation. She then asked if he was the only one who could carry so many people over the mountain. Wang Fugui confirmed her words again. A final brief pause was followed by the order to return behind the wall. The cars drove off and the peddler glanced again at the boy. The protagonist followed with slow steps into his house. Realizing what had happened, the old man rushed after him, shouting that this time the guy should thank him at all. Xiaosu turned around and looked at the merchant. Wang Fugui asked if the boy still held a grudge against him. He tried to prove that it was very kind of him to recommend the boy in the first place. The protagonist asked, "How about the merchant going himself?" Xiaosu said that he didn't mind drawing a map of the route so that Wang Fugui and the rest of the military could go where they needed to go. That way the old man would be able to get behind the wall. At this point, the merchant began to say that he was too old for this. Besides, as it turned out, he had a son. When Xiaosu heard this, he said that he didn't want to talk about it anymore because he himself had a sister and a brother to look after. The tension point in this argument had reached a peak. The protagonist thanked the Wang Fugui family in raised tones for all their help. The old man himself did the same. Immediately afterward, the system added an extra point of gratitude to the guy's account, which he was overjoyed about. Suddenly, the quarrel was interrupted by shouts coming from behind. Turning around, Xiaosu saw the military men take the man with superpowers under their arms and lead him somewhere. The boy asked his interlocutor in horror what they wanted. In response, the old man quietly muttered that he didn't understand either. Then the protagonist thought that apparently the whole thing was that someone had revealed his tendency to an unusual ability. Several people came forward to defend a friend who was being taken away. However, they were immediately confronted with machine guns and ordered to step back. Wang Fugui, who was good at negotiating, approached one of the soldiers and asked what was wrong. The old man pointed out that although this man was a bit troublesome, but he had not made any big mistakes. However, the escort suddenly pulled out a gun and pointed it at the trafficker, shouting for him to shut up and move away. The protagonist picked up Wang Fugui, who almost fainted. It was completely unclear why these people had grabbed Zhang Baogan. Indeed, the only theory was that someone had found out about his unusual abilities. Suddenly, the merchant sighed sadly and stated the fact that the guy was finished. Xiaosu asked his interlocutor why he was saying that. The old man explained that he'd heard that this guy had demonstrated his superpowers last night, and his rat friends had snitched on him. Everyone outside the walls is checking out people with superpowers, fearing that they might be a threat. After saying that, Wang Fugai sighed heavily and asked the protagonist what he would do with someone who was a threat to him. The guy looked seriously at his interlocutor and said that he would have killed such a person. Suddenly, however, the merchant grinned and said that things were a bit different than the guy might assume. He heard that a psychiatric hospital for people with superpowers was organized inside. According to some unconfirmed but pretty serious rumors, various tools are used there to study unusual people. Wang Fugi reminded that if Xiaosu himself or Liu Yuan had any superpowers, then one should not let outsiders know about them. Suddenly, at the other end of the settlement, there was a cry for help. A man with an axe was fighting off the other three troublemakers. The moment the protagonist saw this attack, one man had already been killed. After shredding the body of the second opponent to pieces, the distraught axe-wielding man shouted that he wasn't going to spare those who betrayed Baogan with their cheap tongues. But at the same second, a third opponent standing behind him ran up to the man and plunged a knife into his back. However, the worker was not confused and, swinging his axe, killed the last traitor with one blow. A woman who ran into the house saw her husband fall to the ground, struck in the back. As it turned out, it was Baogan's mother. She fell to her husband's body and burst into tears, saying that if he and her son were not in this world, she could not go on living. At the same instant, the unfortunate woman, without hesitation, drew a dagger from her husband's body and cut her throat with it. Alas, Zhang Baogang was the only child in the family, and if something happened to him, his parents wouldn't be able to survive. Someone in the crowd of gawkers remarked that the boy shouldn't have flashed his strength unnecessarily. Another said that if his father had really had a backbone, he could have broken through the wall. From what he heard and saw, the protagonist was filled with rage. He gritted his teeth and thought bitterly that this was a very finished world. A while later, Xiaosu found himself outside the city school. He leaned against the wall. A teacher stood beside him, sipping a cigarette. The boy said thoughtfully that in today's class, he wanted to tell the students how to stand up to people. The teacher looked up and said that over the years he had taught the children to resist the natural environment, so he didn't want them to think of themselves as such imaginary enemies. The man explained that he had already heard about what had happened in the city not too long ago. He explained that other people's misfortune should not concern them. Looking at the thoughtful face of his interlocutor, the teacher said that if the boy needed it, they could discuss what had happened. The protagonist refused and headed towards the classroom. Suddenly, his attention was drawn to the fact that the students were crowded around one desk. Taking a closer look, Xiaosu saw that his brother was sitting there. The boy began to hope that Liu Yuan's superpower had not been unleashed. Suddenly, a full-figured girl standing nearby told her classmate to advise her brother not to delay class. Otherwise, she would complain to teacher Zheng. The boy replied that his word doesn't solve anything. The students unhappily asked why Xiaosu was so obsessed with learning, and if he really wanted to take control of the entire school. Hearing this, the protagonist thought that he thought the children liked long classes. Suddenly, his younger brother couldn't take it anymore. He jumped up from his seat and shouted to his classmate that his brother had taught him everything he needed to know to save his life. In turn, the ungrateful girl dare not say such things about him. The classmate immediately started backpedaling, saying that if the guy didn't want to talk about it, they could shut the subject down. Sighing heavily, Liu Yuan saw another boy looking at him. Suddenly, the classmate said that he could see that the boy was a little upset. He said that he had a dream yesterday where his father found his stepmother, but she treated him badly. After recovering somewhat, Liu Yuan explained that dreams were usually the opposite of reality. The classmate agreed and said that the boy shouldn't be upset with the other kids. Pretending that he had just arrived here, the protagonist defiantly coughed a few times and entered the office, saying that class was starting. Standing near the blackboard, Xiaosu asked the students if they knew which parts of the human body were the most vulnerable. The children replied that they did not know that. The guy said that in that case, they would start with the neck. He explained that there are about 20 cartilages in this part of the body, which are also as close as possible to the trachea. Damage to one of these cartilages could immediately incapacitate the enemy. Some time had passed since the lesson had started. This time, the boy finished the lesson a little earlier. The students thanked the teacher and went home. Standing near the teacher's desk, Xiaosu hoped that these guys would realize his good intentions. Even though it hadn't happened yet, the protagonist hoped that these kids would never have to use this knowledge in their lives. Suddenly, a merchant appeared on the school's doorstep out of nowhere. In a panting voice, he said that Xiaosu needed to pack his things. Someone called out a handwritten message to the old man, saying that Boss Luo had agreed to let the guy go to accompany the group. Wang Fugui explained that this meant that the guy would have to go on another foray into the Xing Mountains. While the stunned boy was trying to comprehend the information he had received, the merchant moved closer and said that the boy needed to be ready as the group would be leaving soon. The boy was very much alarmed by this. He wondered how this group was able to convince Boss Luo. Considering how often he heard this name, it could be assumed that this person was also related to Mount Zong. In any case, it was clear that the group must have had secret plans for this trip. After realizing this, the guy took quick steps towards Teacher Zhang to discuss something. Meeting his colleague near the school building, Xiaosu explained that he would need to go to Mount Zong. The astonished teacher asked if the guy would definitely have to leave. Xiaosu nodded his head. The protagonist was certain that his colleague had also seen the end of Baogan. He explained that all their lives were in the hands of this group from behind the wall. If their mission failed, it would be difficult for them to live in the trading city in the future. The teacher looked at the boy thoughtfully and suggested that Liu Yuan should live at the school during his absence. The protagonist immediately agreed and thanked the teacher for the opportunity. The man gave the boy a look and asked him to take care of himself. When Xiaosu went home to get his things, he met the worried looks of his relatives. Liu Yuan assured his brother that he shouldn't go there. However, the boy said that there was no need to worry about him, and he would handle everything. The protagonist then held out the money to Xiao Yu and reminded her that the girl would need to buy some cigarettes for Mr. Zheng for the duration of her younger brother's stay with him. After giving away most of his savings, Xiaosu thought that even if his sister had any thoughts about the money, she could just take it and leave without hurting Liu Yuan. After all, in this scorched wasteland, for the sake of profit, even relatives can go against those close to them, though it's unpleasant to think about it. The girl smiled and said that she understood perfectly. Then she assured the boy that he shouldn't worry about anything and asked him to come back safe and sound. Immediately after these words, there was a knock on the front door. Suddenly, the system popped up a notification that shocked the protagonist. In the mission, the player had to refuse to go to Mount Zong with his traveling companions. Xiaosu was greatly surprised that even the palace didn't want him to go there. Perhaps it would really be very dangerous there. After gathering his thoughts, the protagonist walked out to the military, not realizing what he was going to tell them. A girl with blue hair stood right in front of him. She explained that the boy should know who they were by now and said that he had no time to pack, for the group was leaving now. Deciding that imitating insanity would help him once again, Xiaosu twisted his face in surprise at the armed men and said, crossing his fingers, that Dad's father's name was Grandpa and Mom's mother's name was Grandma. The surprised leader of the armed group looked at the strange type, not believing that this man was so sick in the head. Suddenly, one of the officers appeared behind her back. He looked at the situation with a smile and said that there was no point in the guy pretending because they had already dealt with each other. Xiao Su recognized the person Wang Kunyan had approached. It looks like pretending won't work this time. As long as this guy was around, he would have to go even if he didn't want to. Not knowing what else to think of, the protagonist shook his head and said he wasn't going. In that same instant, the task was successfully completed. The guy received a basic skill copying scroll. Wang Kunyan, hearing such audacity, asked why this brat thought he could dictate the rules to them. However, before the bulky man could finish speaking, Xiao Su immediately walked past him and calmly said that he would go. Ignoring the shocked officer, the boy approached the leader of the group. He said he could go on one condition. Xiao Su wanted 30,000 as a reward. The woman refused him and told him that it was only 10,000. Realizing that it would not be possible to make a lot of money, the protagonist demanded to add 10 bags of salt, the same number of packs of cigarettes, and 100 kilograms of rice. In the end, the woman gave in and said that she was willing to pay 30,000. Xiao Su then added that his next condition would be that with his presence in the squad, Wang Kunyang must be absent from this campaign. The thug approached his opponent and said that he was very funny. Meanwhile, it was Wang Kunyan who had searched Xiao Su's house twice. Therefore, it was not out of the question that even on a camping trip, they might have had problems. The leader of the group looked at her approximation and nodded her head. This condition she agreed to much more easily, and to the surprise of her officer, confirmed that he would not be on this trek. The main character said it was great. The guy then pointed out that although they are all members of the same team, he doesn't know whose name is yet. Anyway, all these people introduced themselves. However, the leader of the group, Luo Xinyu, clarified that they do not consider those who are refugees as comrade. The last one introduced herself as a silent girl who skillfully wielded a weapon. Her name was Yang Xiaojin. Looking at his new partner, Xiao Su said that they could now move out. As he got into the military truck, he waved to the relatives who came out to see him off. Liu Yuan was very worried and prayed for his brother. Xiao Yu reassured him, telling him that such a strong man would definitely return safely. A group of armored vehicles convoyed along a narrow forest road. Looking around, the protagonist marveled at the scenery that opened up. Xiao Su remembered that Teacher Zhang had said earlier that the remaining traces of asphalt on the roads were from before the disaster. The boy wondered what these roads looked like before the disaster. However, recently, all the vegetation had noticeably flourished. Even the cabbages in Teacher Zhang's house were taller than ever. Looking at the wild forest, Xiao Su thought that perhaps the time would soon come when a single potato would be enough to feed a family of 3. Suddenly, the boy's stomach rumbled loudly. He was surprised that for some reason the group didn't say anything about snack breaks. But suddenly the protagonist realized that he was currently in a food truck. Taking a good look around, Xiao Su tore off the blanket and found that behind it were water bottles and packs of cookies. It all looked like an incredible delicacy. You had to have great restraint not to jump on the food immediately. Soon the sun had already gone below the horizon. The group, with their headlights on, still kept moving. Suddenly, one of the fighters leaned out of the window and waved his hand and shouted that they would stop here and make camp. After getting out of the car, several military men headed toward the food truck, agreeing that they would split everything equally. As they approached the back of the car, the fighters heard a strange sound coming from the rear platform. Upon opening the locking rack, the military discovered a strange sight. Their guide was sitting next to several open boxes of cookies. One of the fighters asked Xiao Su in horror what he had done here. Chewing the last cookie and stroking his full belly, the protagonist replied that he saw no reason to panic and said he didn't do anything. A commander's car pulled up to the truck. The military men standing nearby were furious that the boy had eaten 5 packs of cookies. They offered to kill him on the spot, because if he kept eating like that, they wouldn't have enough food to get to the 112th wall. Yang Xiaojin stared intently at the main character. However, despite the gaze, she only felt surprised and interested. The military dragged Xiao Su to the ground, who shouted that he wanted to stay with the cookies. One of the unit heads suggested that Luo Xinya go back and get another guide. However, the girl flatly refused, explaining that according to her informant, this was the only person who would be able to guide them through Mount Zong. Instead of replacing the guide, Luo Xinyu let the military do whatever they wanted with the boy, but it should not interfere with their path. She added that when their journey is over, the military can do whatever they want with the boy. Meanwhile, the silent Yang Xiaojin continued to watch the protagonist. Xiao Su walked idly around and kicked the stones lying on the ground. He then overheard 2 military men discussing him. They were surprised that such a man knew how to lead a squad through the Xing Mountains, yet he didn't even understand how to prepare a tent. One of the soldiers said that they should place bets on how long this guide would last before dying here. Xiao Su was surprised that there was such sharp attention to his person, even though he had only eaten some cookies. These words were heard by a thug who was furious that the boy did not consider their stock at all. He warned the boy in an angry voice that he was a common vagrant, and he should not try to break a stone with an egg. The last sentence amused the protagonist very much. He asked the military man what would break if the egg hit a rock. The man looked at the guide in bewilderment and replied that the egg would break. The protagonist sighed heavily and explained that this was wrong. The soldier looked at the boy incomprehensibly and asked what would break in that case. Xiao Su smiled and replied that a chicken's heart would be broken. This curious reply seemed to kill the fighter dead. Suddenly, the protagonist felt her concerned gaze on him. He turned around and looked at the commander's car. Xiao Su was certain that Yang Xiaojin was looking over at him right now. The girl had already looked away by then. But she had a smile on her face, which was the first time the boy had seen it on this usually serious face. Suddenly, somewhere deep in the forest, a deafening roar sounded. The military immediately became very tense, and some of them who were on their first sortie were frightened. The protagonist thought that usually few animals could survive on the edge of the forest. However, this sound told them otherwise. Suddenly, one of the soldiers saw footprints on the ground. He explained that he had not seen anything like that the last time he had been here. Seeing the find, Xiao Su stared at it intently. One of the fighters asked what the guy was staring at for so long. The protagonist studied the outline of the animal's tracks. For a moment, he thought that these guys might be frightened even by the tracks of an ordinary deer. Xiao Su then looked around. The remains of a campfire caught his attention. It was likely that someone had already camped here not too long ago. The boy reassured himself that it is a very bad habit not to clean up his food waste in nature. He then pushed one of the military men away and walked closer to the tracks to get a better look at them. The protagonist easily determined that these were the paw prints of a bear that had been attracted by the food left behind by humans last time. The skeptical soldier standing behind ordered the guide to stop messing with their heads, because it definitely couldn't be bear claws. Xiao Su grinned and ironically said that it certainly looked more like a boar's hooves. After that, the boy got up from the ground and headed straight into the forest. The frightened military men did not immediately realize how far the boy was going to go. The protagonist explained that he wasn't given any cookies, so he would find his own food. Suddenly, one of the soldiers shouted out that the last time their guide died was around here. He told the boy to be careful, for otherwise they would be wasting their time. Xiao Su ran off into the forest, shouting that he was just going to see where the last troublemaker had died. A few minutes later, the lad found himself in a deep grove. He had heard a story that the previous guide had gone down to the river to wash his face. As a result, something bit him, and he died instantly. Picking up a stick from the ground, the boy immediately began sharpening it with his blade. In any case, he would have to be careful what he did. A short time later, he had a fine spear in his hand. After walking a little further, Xiao Su remembered that there must definitely be a water source in the habitats of large animals. Therefore, the footprints of the strange animal should lead him to the river where the guide had been bitten before. It took a little more time before the protagonist actually walked out to the body of water. He moved closer to the turbulent stream and looked around. If looking only at the water, there really wouldn't be anything unusual about it. The guide must have been attacked by some kind of fish lurking underwater. This supports the theory that, like most people, this man did not know about the existence of freshwater fish, which are carnivorous. Looking to the side, the boy saw a burrow of white ants. With this, he would be able to catch a fish. Squatting down next to the anthill, the protagonist began to strike the mound with numerous dagger strokes. Then he took a spear and forged with it the boulder that lay on top. Xiao Su deftly rushed to the core of the anthill and grabbed the huge insect. It was a pretty rare white ant queen. Such bait must be used wisely. Approaching the body of water, Xiao Su threw the insect into the water, not far away from him. Having prepared his spear, the lad assumed a comfortable stance and began to wait for the fish. A few seconds later, the protagonist saw a huge carcass next to the bait. The next instant, a huge fanged creature leapt out of the water. Xiao Su immediately hurled the improvised harpoon and pierced the fish. Pulling up the spear by the rope, the lad dragged the giant prey onto dry land. But suddenly, a strange humming sound caught the hunter's attention. He looked closer and saw a giant-sized silhouette in the body of water. Grabbing his prey, the guy took off at a run. The smell of blood seemed to attract something really creepy. A while later, the soldiers were sitting on the ground, sipping the aroma of fried fish coming from the fire. They looked more and more in the direction where the guide sat, roasting the prey he had caught. The protagonist wanted to start eating, but suddenly the system highlighted a new task that asked the player to share his joy with the others. Xiaosu looked unhappily towards the military, who had been making fun of him all this time. The guy took a huge fish and approached the soldiers with it. They were surprised that the guide had decided to share his booty with them so unexpectedly. But suddenly, the guy turned around and headed towards his campfire, saying he just wanted to share his joy. Indeed, the task appeared to be accomplished. A unit of dexterity was added to Xiaosu's characteristics. Then he did turn around and said he could share the fish in exchange for 3 bottles of water. The well-stocked military men immediately agreed. Immediately, the soldiers gleefully pounced on their prey, greedily ripping it to shreds. Young Xiaojin looked towards the departing Xiaosu with a smile. After hesitating for a moment, the girl followed him. The protagonist sat down next to the remaining half of the fish when suddenly, Yang Xiaojin joined him. She looked into the guy's eyes with interest and muttered something about fish. Shifting his gaze from the girl's eyes, the boy came to a horrified halt. Yan Xiaojin pointed her M9 pistol at him and calmly looked into the guy's eyes.
Pet the cat.